Right. Looks like we are ready to begin. Welcome back, people. How have you been? Hope you had a great week. And yes, today is the day of the final analysis of Singularity. Indeed, as you can read from the title description, we are already streaming here over at Twitch. And I think everything is up and running. There we go. Good. We are ready to begin. Welcome back, guys. Welcome back. Today we'll have a pretty... It shouldn't take a lot of time to finish this analysis because the game was quite linear. And honestly, while it had a relatively long duration for an FPS, roughly 12 hours. It is still not one of those crazy long RPGs that we usually analyze. Alright, welcome everyone, welcome. For those of you who are watching this as a YouTube VOD in the future, as I always mention, for those of you who are watching this as a YouTube VOD in the future, here on the channel we do metaphysical analysis once we have finally played all of what a video game has to offer, all of the secrets, pretty much everything that I can explore of the game, every inch of the terrain. After completing the game 100% or close to that at least, we do the final analysis, the metaphysical final analysis. That's why at the beginning, before you get into the analysis of Singularity itself, I will leave a 30-minute explanation of the metaphysical methodology that we use here over at Twitch to just so you have a reference and a context of all of the things that I will mention, because I know that for the first time I have seen these people who stumble upon my metaphysical analysis for the first time. I understand how it can be a bit confusing. For those of you who are watching this live here over at Twitch, or you discover the channel immediately now, you have my panels explaining everything down below, so you don't have that problem. You just read the panels and more or less you have the context of what I do here. For those of you who are watching this as a YouTube VOD in the future, thanks for watching. And I will include the metaphysical explanation right now for all of you, and then we come back for the specific analysis of Singularity. But first, have the metaphysical methodology that we use to analyze games. Alright. Welcome back. For those of you who are watching this as a YouTube VOD in the future, for those of you who are watching this live here on Twitch, I know it's always weird when we do this, but when we do this post, but pretty much it is required because you know the context, but those who discover the channel through YouTube, they don't have the panels that I have down here for all of you. Alright. We begin, people. We begin with the case of Singularity. Pretty much a very interesting case developed by Raven Software. Let's begin with the developer, Raven Software. It's an internal development studio that still exists of Activision. Pretty much they co-developed in the past. We covered all of this in the first stream, all of the history of the studio, but pretty much just so you have a brief context, it's an internal development studio of Activision that always co-developed the Call of Duty series, so they had access to the engine of that legendary franchise. They had access to all of the assets from Sledgehammer Games, from pretty much Infinity Ward, pretty much of the ones from that do Black Ops from Treyarch. They have all of those. Right. So with all of that, they created a very specific game called Singularity, which belongs to the same genre, which leads me to the second thing that I want to cover before we begin the analysis, which is the genre classification. This game is a first-person shooter, from now on an FPS, in the same vein as Call of Duty. You could think of it like that, but combined with some level design, with some gameplay elements from Bioshock, from Half-Life, from Dishonored, all of those single-player story-oriented FPS games that wanted to create a sub-variation of the classic World War II setting that was so dominant originally in the genre with Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, and Battlefield, of course. So it's a divergent style from the classic futuristic military setting of Battlefield or Call of Duty, though it does bring some elements into the story that belong to that style. But still, because it's about the Soviet Union, but it introduces a lot of fictional elements that far exceed the usual setting of Call of Duty, pretty much, or Battlefield, the classic military setting. Alright, with that brief intro, with the metaphysical analysis methodology already explained for everyone, let us get into the first category of the analysis. It shouldn't be a pretty long analysis because the game wasn't that long by itself. So if we are done with that, then we can play some other game for some hours until we reach the 4-hour mark that we usually cover. Alright, people, gameplay. Let's begin with the gameplay, and as I always say, the huge mistake of reviewers in this sense is that they usually include a lot of video in order to cover the problem that is that they are sadly unable to explain merely with words how a classic and normal gameplay situation of the game that they are analyzing works. So you'll see how I'll describe it, and you'll see that you'll be able to picture the game even if you haven't played it. So imagine Call of Duty. If you played that one, for example, imagine any roughly modern FPS game from the late 2000 from the late it should, no, it was previous to 2010, so late 2000s, right? Because I don't know, it was 2010, I think, exactly when Singularity was released. Well, I don't know if it was 2009 or 2010. I think it was 2010. Alright, so 2010. Yeah, because the game included some story elements that involved that year. Yeah, 2010. So, any FPS from that period of time, you have your gun, etc. You go through a very linear map, a very linear level design, pretty similar to Call of Duty, as I've said, because the game inherited the level design of that game. You go through that, and in terms of the gameplay, you get the same physics, and when I say the same, I mean exactly the same shooting physics, animations, the how heavy the impact of the animations are, and everything of Call of Duty. Imagine Call of Duty. Specifically, and here I'll add a bit of detail, imagine Call of Duty Black Ops 1. Specifically. Eraser, why that one specifically? Well, because the combat in Singularity, and this is the key why reviewers usually are unable to explain this, and it's a huge problem. The very core of the game, and why I am mentioning specifically Call of Duty Black Ops 1, is that Singularity follows a gameplay flow of having a close-up and personal combat against enemies. Yes, something that we usually don't see in the Modern Warfare series, that we usually don't see in the Infinity Warfare series, whichever ones that were developed by Infinity Ward or Sledgehammer Games. No, this one is much more similar to a Treyarch Call of Duty, right? So that is the key. The combat is close up and personal, and by that and it's exponentially exacerbated. By that I mean that you have a lot of melee enemies, something which doesn't necessarily exist in Call of Duty Black Ops, but it is reflected in that game. Why? Because in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, in the Modern Warfare series, and all of the ones that are developed, they have different names. For example, the Advanced Warfare, I think that one was by Sledgehammer or something like that. Infinity Ward and Sledgehammer and Treyarch. Let's make that division. So in those games developed by Infinity Ward and Sledgehammer, generally the idea is to make the player feel that they're in the middle of a huge battlefield, right? With lots of enemies, etc, etc, etc. Lots of enemies, a war going on around you, a lot of explosions, a lot of smoke, a lot of things and stuff blowing up and happening all around you. It's the classic feeling that we get from classic World War II FPS games, traditionally from the early 2000s, right? That's the usual feeling that we get in terms of the gameplay in Modern Warfare or World at War or Battlefield games, even Battlefield 3, which was developed later than the ones that I'm making a reference to, like I'm making a reference to Battlefield 2, for example, classic World War II simulators, Medal of Honor. This one is completely different, and it follows the huge influence of Black Ops 1. The combat is close-up and personal. It is individual against each enemy, because a single one can kill you, definitely, especially in the early game sections of the game. So, and it is exacerbated because most enemies will engage you in melee rather than ranged, which would be the case of Call of Duty Black Ops 1 and all Call of Duty games in which most enemies are ranged. Here we can see the first variation of the gameplay, and the first point that I wanted to highlight, the first element of the gameplay category of the analysis people, the close-up and personal combat. Right, that is introduced through a magnificent enemy variety. You get zombies, you get teleporting, they are called Zex with C at the beginning and K. C-E-K. So you get teleporting mutants, you get zombies that engage in melee and are very, very terrifying. You also go up against ranged enemies in the form of the Russian and Soviet soldiers from 1955. You go up against some special variations of the zombies and the Zex and the mutated teleporting creatures. You go up against Zerglings. They have no name in the game, but I call them Zerglings. They are like the Zerglings in StarCraft, very, very small parasites that explode when they are near you. They would be like Banelings technically, because the Banelings are the ones that explode. Always a StarCraft reference. The RTS genre always needs to be present. Right. So the science fiction enemy variety that the game introduces is mostly melee, and that has a lot of impact on the gameplay mechanics. Why? Because most of the enemies that you'll go up against, they are melee enemies with a lot of interesting features. For example, the teleporting mutated they are not the zombies. The teleported mutated creatures, the Zex, pretty much. For example, they are immune to your bullets when they go invisible. Yeah, they can go invisible. So they approach you and they go invisible. This is a perfect, there we can see a perfect method of balancing the advantage of the player, of balancing the original problem that exists when you try to translate an FPS engine with the rules of an FPS game like Call of Duty against melee enemies like that. In the zombies mode of Call of Duty, for example, this is balanced in a lot of cases by having for example, the assault hounds in the first Call of Duty Black Ops, or in Advanced Warfare. I played Advanced Warfare the most. Or having in Advanced Warfare, for example, there are zombies that jump, that leap great distances and attack you. There are some others that are like circlings and do explode, like in Singularity. So the first thing that they needed to address, and they addressed it perfectly, is how to balance melee enemies against a player that has access to a myriad of ranged weapons and could easily kill them without any kind of issue. Well, they balanced that, and this is the core of the success of the Singularity. If this element wouldn't have existed, the game would have been a failure, because we would have been able to kill all enemies easily, and there would have not been a sense of threat, and without a sense of threat, the sense of progression, the psychological sense of progression created on the player's mind would have been negligible, and as a direct consequence of that, the game wouldn't have felt as a challenge and not even a complex system to master at all. Like, it would have been so easy. Imagine the campaign of Call of Duty with a limited amount of spawns, but instead of ranged enemies that kill you out of nowhere, they are very, very challenging. Imagine melee enemies that simply don't stand a chance against the player. So, in that sense, the core balance of the gameplay mechanics, it's perfectly executed. The Zerglings will explode and cause you a lot of damage. The Zex will teleport and be invulnerable to damage until you don't activate your time manipulation device, which is something that I'll go back to in a minute. And the zombies, well, they are, let's say, they are the first enemies that you stumble upon. They need to be a bit weaker because they kind of like introduce the player to the basic gameplay mechanics. So in that sense, they are the weaker ones out of the bunch. But still, they can surprise you because they are. It's difficult to explain, but I'll bet you'll be able to picture it in your mind. Remember the zombies from The Legend of Zelda or Majora's Mask, that they are very thin, like the mummies. They are difficult to target here as well because they are extremely thin and they have a very erratic movement. That's how they balanced it. It's a weaker enemy. It's still the weaker enemy, the weakest enemy out of the bunch. But the movements are erratic, and if they get to you, they generally spawn a bit more. And when they get to you, they will deal a lot of damage. There's another enemy which is a kind of variation of the of that zombie that is also very easy to kill because they are blind. And yeah, pretty much I didn't have a lot of problem dealing with it, but basically it's a different variation of the zombie. So pretty much they balanced the gameplay mechanics extremely well, and it's something that shouldn't be taken for granted. It should never be taken for granted, people, never, because generally the first thing that happens when you try to transition an FPS game into to an environment with melee enemies, think about Half-Life, think about Bioshock, you have to measure it kind of like painstakingly precise. You need to be extremely accurate because it's way too easy to have an unbalanced gameplay from that point onwards, because the player will have access to a lot of weapons, and he'll be able to beat all of the enemies easily. For example, the Metro series handles this with survival horror elements through the use of ammo scarcity, which I think is the worst solution ever, because you are distorting the essence of the first-person shooter mechanics by forcing the ammo scarcity on the player. Basically, you are destroying a game resource to compensate the lack of the developer to pretty much of pretty much being unable to calibrate the combat effectiveness of ranged weapons against melee enemies. So I think it's a terrible idea, that of Metro. Sorry for those of you who are fans of the Metro series. I don't like survival horror games in general because I see them as I see the ammo scarcity element as a defect, that they, as a flaw that they are trying to use to compensate the lack of capability by the developer of balancing the ranged combat gameplay mechanics against melee enemies. So that's why I don't like survival horror games, but it's also the reason why I criticize, for example, games like Metro or The Last of Us so much, because they compensate. I know that they will tell me that but you don't get the point. They're just trying to create that psychological sense of a threat. They are trying to be like a horror movie, and if the character can defend himself easily, you take away that horror element from the survival horror genre. You're taking out the survival aspect of it, of looking for ammo and etc. Well, fortunately, the idea of Singularity doesn't work like that. Singularity is basically a Call of Duty game that absorbs a lot of mechanics from Bioshock, from Dishonored, from Half-Life, and it really shows. Why? Because in those games that I'm mentioning, while ammo isn't as generous, it isn't as generous as in Singularity. In Singularity, the ammo is extremely generous. You don't have ammo scarcity at all. While that is the case, never Dishonored or Bioshock, they never get to the point of ammo scarcity of Metro, for example. In that sense, the player is allowed to defend himself using ranged weapons mostly all the time. So in that sense, it brings elements from those games, it absorbs elements from those games, it inherits elements from those games, but at the same time, it never forgets its Call of Duty roots. Ammo is extremely generous in Singularity, so if you like FPS games, generally in terms of the genre classification, this is a first-person shooter. This is not a survival horror. It doesn't have it may be a horror game because it has some scenes that are from literally taken out from movies. But it's not. It doesn't have ammo scarcity at all. That's not a gameplay component, and I am glad for it because if it had ammo scarcity, I would have straight up not played the game at all. It's one of the worst elements that I despise. But well, that's extremely subjective. Let's go back to the objective portion of the gameplay analysis. That lack of ammo scarcity makes for a very intense shooting game that it doesn't matter what enemy you go up against. If you go up against the zombies or the teleporting creatures or the Zerglings or the Soviet troopers, it doesn't matter if it's melee or ranged, it's perfectly compensated. The gameplay mechanics are perfectly compensated, perfectly balanced and compensated. And the second element that contributes to this perfect balance, besides the lack of ammo scarcity, the fact that you have an abundance of ammo, the second element that contributes to this balance is the fact, that in Singularity, you not only don't have ammo scarcity, but you also don't have unlimited stamina. Now, stamina is not measured in this game as with a bar or something like that, but you can only sprint for a limited amount of time, and also you don't have automatic regeneration of your health in this game. This is a paramount element, a very important element that makes for the other 50% of the balance that the gameplay mechanics of this game show, that they have, pretty much, that they can boast of. So the combination, you have limited resources. You don't have automatic regeneration like in Call of Duty. That's the huge difference. Well, someone is going to say, but in the first Call of Duty, you also don't have automatic combat regeneration. Well, you get the point. The game was developed back in 2010, and by that time, Call of Duty had made the shift. All FPS games had made the shift to automatic health regeneration long ago by then. So by then, it was already the standard. So this game actually went against the modern trends, and it followed the recent example of BioShock, which had been released back in 2008. And Dishonored was 2012. It was a bit more. It was a bit later, I think. So yes, people. The combination of having a health regeneration, of not having health regeneration, and the fact that you also cannot sprint endlessly, those two elements, I'll bundle them up together. So that element of having limited resources, let's call it limited resources, plus the, as I've said, the fact that you cannot simply, that the melee enemies are very well balanced with extra mechanics, they make for a very balanced experience. And because of that, the core of the gameplay mechanics is pretty well executed. Because of these metaphysically objective reasons. See that it doesn't have to do with my mental perception. The game does have limited resources, and that directly influences the efficiency of the balance of the gameplay mechanics. The fact that the game has ammo, that the game has ammo abundance, let's say it like that so I don't have to repeat the negative. Ammo abundance, that it has ammunition abundance, plus those two elements make sure, so limited health resources, and, well, it doesn't have stamina, but sprinting time, and also time powers. It has limited resources in general. So lack of health regeneration and having limited sprinting, plus abundance of ammo, they make for a very, very balanced experience. It is true, and I will criticize this as a flaw, that the game doesn't have a balanced experience by the time you reach the end game. But that's at the very end, so by then you already figured out all of the gameplay mechanics, so it gets unbalanced, yes, but by the end. The formula kind of like extinguishes or loses its efficiency by the mid-game, late game, and end game. By the end of the game, I would say in the last stream, for example, I could hardly get killed. Like, I could use a time manipulation power, that we'll get to that in a minute, that could basically slow down time, and like that you could kill all of the enemies. But I think it was even intended at that point, because by the end of the game you get kind of like unlimited time manipulation resource, which is something that I'll cover next, which leads me to the next element precisely, and you can use it in an unlimited fashion without any kind of limit, and because of that you'll be able to beat most of the enemies in the end game, all of the enemies in the end game, easily. But they are the last 3 to 2 hours of game. Previous to that, we also had kind of like the Ultralisk enemy variety in that sense. It's like a giant behemoth. I call it the Ultralisk, like in StarCraft. It's like a behemoth that you have to. It's basically a bullet sponge that you have to that throws missiles from its mouth, some huge explosive missiles, as if it had a missile launcher in his mouth or something like that. Well, so pretty good variety up until the end. pretty good enemy variety up until the end, and because of those two elements, this is the core that you need to remember about this game. The element of ammunition abundance combined with the limited health and stamina resources, the limited health and sprinting time and time manipulation resources, those being limited and the ammo being abundant, those make for a very balanced experience that perfectly compensates and fixes the usual problem that games with melee, that FPS games with melee enemies have, which is the fact that they never reach you. Pretty much, in layman terms, they never reach you, and that makes for a very unbalanced experience. Call of Duty Zombies, as I've said, manages that the same way this game handled it. It is handled the same way, by giving zombies leap abilities or explosions or those things, pretty much, or hounds or zombie hounds, like in the first one, in the first Call of Duty Zombies. Pretty much, they have their methods of managing that, and Singularity in that sense, it's a modified version of Call of Duty Zombies. So if you like Call of Duty Zombies, I especially recommend this game. That's why I'm mentioning this. So pretty much that's the second element that I wanted to analyze. So first one, as I said, a very well balanced gameplay experience with pretty good enemy variety. That one could be the second element. Pretty good enemy variety and a balanced experience because of the combination of these two sub-elements that I just mentioned. This leads me to the third element. Because we not only have sprinting time as a resource, because at the end of the day, even if there isn't a stamina bar, sprinting to get away from the zombies and outrunning them and then shoot them, it is a resource. But the third element that this leads me to, that I have been mentioning since the beginning of the review, the time manipulation device. Yes. The yellow bar, there's an orange bar, sorry, it's orange. Right below the health bar, you'll have that. And as a direct consequence of that, you'll have a third resource. Not only your health doesn't regenerate automatically, but the philosophy behind that automatic health regeneration, which isn't in this game. In this game you have to use kind of like a med packs and steam packs like in Bioshock or Dishonored. It's the same system in that sense. That, as I've said, it helps balance the gameplay mechanics against melee enemies while having ranged weapons at your disposal. But there's a third element that does inherit that auto-regeneration philosophy. This one does auto-regenerate on it by itself, which is that orange bar right below the health bar. You get it in the mid-game, I would say. It's still early mid-game, central mid-game, let's say. Halfway through the mid-game, which is a time manipulation device. It's a time manipulation device. And when you get that, you also have kind of like time manipulation steam packs. They have a different name, but they fulfill the very same purpose. You eventually reload your time manipulation, and if you run out of time manipulation energy while in combat, you can kind of like reload with a relatively slow animation, but in a small brief period of time in which you can get killed. So you can also reload your time manipulation energy. But if you leave it by itself for a lot of time, it also auto-regenerates. Extremely slowly, but it does. Generally, I haven't had any problem of steam pack or energy scarcity at all. Perhaps a bit at the beginning of the game. In the early game, this game has that problem, that it extinguishes the difficulty curve by the end of the game. It extinguishes the difficulty curve. And it's not that I'm a pro or anything like that, because someone could argue, well, it's just that you got better at the game. No, it's not subjective. You have many more tools, and many more weapons at your disposal to deal with enemies, pretty much, and you can clearly identify those that are OP. All right, so getting back to the third resource, the time manipulation energy. It auto regenerates slowly. You can use a steam pack, blah 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 blah. Time manipulation steam packs. What does it provide you? You get it by the, as I've said, by the end of the early game, at the beginning of the mid game, and with that you can do a lot of things. The first thing that it does is that the second you do that, that is the moment you get the time manipulation device, the game transitions from, is when the game fully transitions, is the exact moment in which the game fully transitions from being 99% almost purely Call of Duty Black Ops 1 to being to be its own thing. It's at that exact moment when you get the time manipulation device. First of all, first effect that it happens without any kind of upgrade or anything to it, you get your melee attack with a knife gets replaced by a short range time explosion that you do, that it consumes time manipulation. That's a very very interesting aspect, that in order to perform a melee attack in a game you have to use time manipulation energy. That's pretty well executed. So because you could simply beat the whole game if that wasn't the case. So pretty well executed in that sense. I cannot complain at all. So good. In that sense, that's the first consequence. Second consequence, you can manipulate the environment, and here's when I'm going to introduce a very usual element that I pay a lot of attention to in games, which is the influence of the gameplay mechanics on the level design, and vice versa, the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. We'll leave We'll leave the later for the level design category of the analysis, pretty much the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics for the third category of the analysis. But I wanted to analyze for a second this element of the gameplay mechanics, the influence the specifically that the time manipulation device has on the level design. Why? Because you can target enemy creatures, target the environment itself. By that I mean that you can, for example, create cover points or destroy them accordingly in order to protect yourself or expose enemies according to the situation. Pretty much it's the same element that they recycled all over the game, which are kind of like some small cement blocks that are kind of like attached to the ground, and you can make them age or rejuvenate. That's pretty much how the time manipulation device works in terms of affecting the level design. There are also some Portal, Half-Life like puzzles in there with this mechanic, but pretty much in terms of the combat, which is the focus of the gameplay category of the analysis, pretty much I will mention that yes, pretty much the idea is that you can, for example, the teleporting zombies that I mentioned previously, you can target them and use your time manipulation device energy to make them age. So remember that I said that they were invisible, that they were invulnerable when invisible? Well, for example, you could turn them visible with the melee attack that I mentioned previously, but you can also make them age if you target them directly and you press G. It was to make them age directly, and they kind of like get stuck in place. Now, you can only target them individually through this method, but it's extremely effective. The time manipulation device doesn't get all of the powers that I'm going to mention immediately. You gradually get them through the mid-game gameplay mechanics, to be specific, from hour 5 to be exact, from hour 4 or 5 of gameplay onwards up until the very end of the game, because you technically get one last upgrade almost by the end of the game. That doesn't make any sense at all for me because there's no final boss. So yeah, pretty much. You get a melee attack that makes them visible, that makes the sex visible, for example, and that makes them vulnerable. And the game is very efficient at pitting you against them once you get that power in order to, you know, learn those gameplay mechanics. In that sense, it's clearly designed, it was clearly made by professional developers that had a lot of experience, kind of like introducing the gameplay mechanics for the player. Clearly, they are the experienced developers of Call of Duty. Right, so you get a new fancy melee attack that replaces the knife. You get to interact with the environment and do some pretty well designed puzzles. For example, making a box rejuvenate. For example, making it a crate first age and kind of like being flat instead of the normal shape it has. You make it flat and all destroyed, kind of like as if it was stomped, all flat. You place it kind of like below below a gate or something like that, and below a curtain, a metallic curtain, and then you make it rejuvenate when it's right below it, and since it was flat, it goes back to the original shape, and that opens up a lot of that solves the puzzle and allows the player to progress through the game. It opens up for a lot of possibilities in terms of puzzles. So from that point onwards, the game does get some puzzles. They are pretty well designed. But in terms of the gameplay mechanics, in terms of the combat, the time manipulation device does play a significant role, because when getting to the end of the mid-game gameplay mechanics, you get the third power, pretty much, which is the blue sphere that you have seen me use all the time, which is basically an area of effect, slow time, or pretty much stop time field, pretty similar to the Protoss ion field from the Templars, that slows down time, or the Mothership for that matter. So yes, that's the most OP power of the game. Pretty much with that power alone, you can easily beat the game without any kind of issue. That's why it is provided to the player by the end of the mid-game gameplay mechanics, to be precise. Yeah, because it was at the end of the second stream or something like that, or by the end of the... Yeah, by the end of the first stream. Yeah. Mid-game gameplay mechanics. The thing is that it consumes a lot of time manipulation energy. You can run out of it, and until you master it, you'll have a hard time dealing with enemies only with bullets alone. Because of the variety that I mentioned previously, that a lot of them teleport and they leap at you, and they become invisible, and they can pretty much they have several resources at the beginning that help eliminate, that help balance the efficiency of the player in combat. Pretty much. So that last element, the time manipulation field, is the most effective. I think it's the best designed one. It's absolutely perfectly executed. It has a very limited range if you don't update it, something that I did by the end of the game, and would have been a huge difference at the beginning, because you can increase the AoE, the area of effect, pretty much. So as you can see, the time manipulation device changes. It also unlocks kind of like extra secrets, small secrets that the game has, that basically provide you money that you can spend on upgrades. Which leads me to the fourth point of the gameplay category of the analysis, which is, besides having a balanced gameplay, besides not having automatic regeneration and all of the things that I have mentioned, besides this third resource that I'm mentioning, besides everything that I've mentioned in these 40 minutes, the fourth element is the skill tree, in terms of the core of the combat experience. Yes, while the game doesn't have floating damage numbers, while the game doesn't have um, heavy RPG influences more than the health bar that doesn't have auto regeneration, but that could easily be inherited from Bioshock, which isn't an RPG, or from the original Call of Duty, even that wasn't an RPG and it had you had a set amount of life, because that's how it originally worked back when Doom was designed. Doom and Wolfenstein were designed like that. You have 100% health. It's a set amount of health. You don't have auto regeneration. So, and many more, and many more. So it's not even inherited from the RPG genre. It's inherited from classic FPS games. So besides that, the fourth element, it's also crucial. It's also quite important. The game does have a skill tree. In that sense, it's a unique thing about this game. It is true that in Bioshock and in Dishonored, you can improve your power somehow, so we'll assume that it's inherited from Bioshock, and because pretty much it was released previously, and Dishonored was released after this game. So, for example, the one that a viewer mentioned not so long ago, for example, it could be an influence inherited from Arx Fatalis, for example, from Arx Fatalis, that also have that magic system. Here is a time manipulation, but it's the same as magic. Alright, it has a skill tree. By skill tree, I don't mean a full-blown Borderlands-like skill tree. I just mean that you can upgrade your time manipulation powers and your overall stats. By your overall stats, I mean the total amount of health you have, the effectiveness of the steam packs, the amount of time that you can sprint, the speed, the speed of the animation in that you have to go through in order to heal yourself. There's actually a delay between starting healing and the healing effect, the healing taking effect. So there's a difference between the animation and the execution of the effect. That will get you killed most of the time, because you'll say, no problem, I have a lot of steam packs, I use them, but you realize that when you use them, you're kind of like making this movement, kind of like applying the bandages and everything, but as the character is doing that, you're still taking damage, and you'll probably get killed, because it's a very slow animation. That is another perfect element that objectively balances the gameplay mechanics. So, as you can see, this game, they took a lot of measures to perfectly balance it. Going back to the skill tree, you can also increase, as I've said, the air effect damage of your time manipulation energy field. You can make your melee time manipulation attack more effective, for example, as well. Deal more damage, not by a significant amount, but well. And you can also improve a myriad of stats like the ones that I've mentioned. For example, you can increase your time manipulation energy, the regeneration efficiency. You can increase your melee defense and your ranged defense. But it's extremely well balanced, this as well, because in order to get access to those upgrades, first you need to stop by something called an augmentor station, which are kind of like perfectly distributed throughout the game, though there are some parts of it in which I wished they placed them more frequently. Atomic Heart is another game that could easily be recommended as similar to this one, and the Stalker series. In that sense, the augmentor stations are spread across the level design of the game, They are not extremely frequent, which is positive because otherwise it would be way too unbalanced. Some sections would be extremely unbalanced. And then there are two more things that we need to take into account. First, that in order to get those upgrades, you need something called E99 energy that is basically money. It's the in-game currency that you get in the game, and you have access to this currency only if you solve most of the puzzles that the game offers to you. You get the extra money. There's some that you basically cannot miss, even if the game is extremely linear in its level design. You'll get money, but you won't get as much as the required amount to get all of the upgrades, pretty much. So, and those make a huge difference. So, you see that it's a perfect loop. You need to explore the time manipulation. The game encourages slow-paced and methodic gameplay sections that will encourage the player to explore all of the secrets of the Katorga 12 island, of all of the level design, of the game, all of the small narrow passages that the game has, all of the small quirks that it has, and basically, I'll get to this once we get to the level design. But basically, you have two ways, and generally one has extra goodies, one has the extra E99. And the other one is the way you need to go in order to progress through the story. Pretty simple design, could have been better. That's something I'll criticize in a moment. But basically, in order to access the Augmentor station, you need E99 energy, which is the currency. You need money. You need to stumble upon the station. But you also need another element that balances this even further beyond, which is the which is the time manipulation device blueprints. The blueprints. You need to get the blueprints, the schematics, call them however you like. The how to get access to that upgrade. You need to. It's basically looting a specific object that is generally extremely well hidden in the game's level design. Generally, the TMD blueprints are not as evident to find as the as E99 energy, as the currency, because they can drastically make your character. They can make your character drastically stronger. They are the key of your success in this game. The time the TMD, the time manipulation device blueprints. They will unlock all of the stat improvements that I have been constantly mentioning for this fourth element of the analysis. So the game, through that, if you want to get the most out of it, it encourages slow-paced, methodical exploration of the environment. Pretty well executed. It also has some fast-paced sections, but they are kind of like clearly defined. Like, you know exactly when a section is going to be fast-paced and full of action and explosions, and when it's going to be kind of like slow and methodical, and perhaps stumbling upon an extra zombie in order to get the blueprints that I'm mentioning to unlock them at the Augmentor. But it doesn't end there. While it has this limited skill tree system, there's a fifth element, which are the weapon stations. I think they had a different name, but basically the weapon stations. At the weapon stations, you can not only refill ammo through spending your currency, but they also have weapon upgrades. They are generic. The weapon upgrades are generic for all of them. They are the same. They are basically three: improving the damage they deal, improving the clip capacity so you don't have to reload so frequently, and then the reload speed in case you do have to reload, because that's as I've said, this is a direct consequence of having that close-up personal combat against zombies instead of going up against the south and endless enemies like in Modern Warfare. It's a direct consequence of the philosophy behind the level design that this game has inherited from the Black Ops style that it has. Since combat is close-up and personal, reloading, that means extending the clip, does have a direct impact, and reload speed, they both have a direct impact. So, however, in order to get these upgrades, in order to upgrade your weapons, contrary to what happens with the time manipulation skill tree energy powers that you need to get the blueprints, in order to upgrade your weapons, well, you can refill their ammo through E99 currencies, through the common currency of the game. In order to upgrade your weapons, you need something called tech points, right? It's generic, it's the same for all weapons. You can only upgrade them twice for each category, for the clip capacity, for the reload speed, and the damage they deal. You can only upgrade them twice, and each time you do it, the first upgrade, the first damage upgrade, the first clip capacity upgrade, the first reload speed upgrade, they cost 1 tech point. The second one costs 2 tech points for each of them. So in order to max a weapon's damage, clip capacity, and reload speed, you will need 3 points to get them all at level 1, and then you will need another 6 points in order to fully to have a fully upgraded weapon, to have them fully upgraded. So it's a grand total, because they are very scarce. I should mention this because I'm mentioning them like you get tech points. No, they are very, very scarce, and basically you'll have to choose the weapon you want to invest on. Basically, you get a grand total then of 9 points to max a weapon. But the problem is this, people. Those 9 points, unless you methodically explore all of the terrain, I don't know if you'll be able to fully upgrade your weapons by the end of the game. I could do it, but I explore the game slowly, as I usually do. Why? Because you gradually unlock the weapons, and even I made this mistake. For example, I fully upgraded the damage capacity of my shotgun, thinking that the game would only have 4 weapons, and no, the game does have 7 weapons, so I could barely fully upgrade my minigun. I had kind of like a Gatling minigun, like Tychus from StarCraft, pretty similar. The Gatling minigun, I could barely fully upgrade it by the end of the game, because I was lacking precisely those extra 3 points from fully upgrading the damage of my shotgun. I also spent 1 point at the beginning on the pistol in order to upgrade the damage, because basically at the beginning you can only upgrade the very few weapons that you have. You gradually unlock them in this order. First the pistol, which is called the Centurion, then the shotgun, which is basically, yeah, it's a shotgun. Basically, it had a different name. The shotgun, then the Valkyrie, which is the automatic rifle that I chose as one of my main weapons, and then a sniper rifle, then a grenade launcher, and then the minigun that I had. So since the minigun was it was pretty similar to the one in Doom 2016, in that sense. So we got it. I got it by the end of the game. So yes, pretty much you won't have an exact distribution unless you've already played the game once. There's no way, because you imagine that there are only 4 weapons at the beginning, because there's a huge period of time between the 4th weapon and the 5th weapon. So yeah, pretty much. But no, the game does have a bit more. I originally thought that the weapon variety was going to be only 4 weapons, and no, it does have 7. It's still extremely limited. Even for a Call of Duty game, it does have more than 7 weapons. For example, I remember that Call of Duty World at War and Modern Warfare and even Black Ops, they have a much better variation, because you could have Soviet weapons, you could have American weapons, and you could have, for example, British weapons. I remember in Call of Duty 2 that we played at the beginning of the year, you had different rifles that behaved differently for each. They're not factions, because you don't have multiplayer up and running, but they basically have different sets according to the campaign that you are playing. Remember that in Call of Duty 2 you have the Soviet campaign, the British, and the American one. So there was more weapon variety, even in games of the same genre. I get it that here it's compensated through the time manipulation device in terms of weapon variety, which would be the 5th point of the gameplay mechanics analysis, but still, it could have been better. It's quite good for the length of the game, but in that sense, the flow would be the length of the game. But well, going back to what I was mentioning, you can upgrade your weapons at a different station that is called a weapon station or something like that, and they're spread across the map in a very different way. They are a bit more frequently. The game developers definitely want to ensure that you don't run out of ammunition, but there's a crucial point here. Very subtle, very subtle. Reviewers generally don't pay attention to this, and it's a severe, a grave mistake, which is the fact that while you need tech points to upgrade the weapons, you still need the shared currency of E99 energy to refill your ammo and upgrade your skill tree at the other station, at the augmentor that I mentioned previously. So you have to choose. I love how the game's design forces the player to choose between having a full ammo clip or saving that very same currency. I think they are worth 50.99 energy for each stack of 100 bullets for the minigun and the Valkyrie. They have different proportions for each weapon. It's roughly 25% of your ammunition per stack that you buy. So it forces the player to choose between refilling their ammo and or upgrading the skill tree talents, like increasing the total amount of health, like as I've said, how fast you heal yourself, the efficiency of the health pack and the steam pack, the fact that you have more powerful time manipulation powers, and pretty much all of those things. So that's an amazing level design choice. Because while the game doesn't have ammo scarcity, it has a very intelligent and well designed choice system scarcity, we would say, because you can actually eventually run out of ammo if you don't refill your weapons or at the stations, which aren't scarce, so you shouldn't have that problem. But you do lose your income, your currency income. You do lose your currency income, which is absolutely magnificent if you think about it, because you are not distorting the first-person shooter mechanics of the game. You are not distorting the first-person shooter mechanics of the game at all, but you are forcing the player to make strategic decisions. This is a brilliant idea that I deeply appreciate that they introduced in the game. In that sense, it's pretty well executed, because people, the idea is that it forces the player to make strategic decisions, and the best part of it is that they have those strategic decisions that the player has to make. They have a long-lasting impact. Because I'm sure that if I hadn't spent so much E99 currency on refilling ammo at the beginning of the game, I would have been able to access the skill tree talents much earlier, and that would have given me an advantage in the mid-game gameplay mechanics, which was pretty much the difficulty spike of the game. So the game does impose a strategic decision making on the player that has a long-lasting impact throughout the whole course of the game that I deeply appreciate. In that sense, it's very well designed, and definitely the reason why the game does have a lot of tension. It builds up a lot of tension when dealing with handling the in-game currency that it provides. Like, it's an element, there's an economic component that you don't find, for example, in Call of Duty. So it's an improvement. It's the same as in Bioshock with the dollars, and in Dishonored, I think there isn't a currency system, if I remember correctly. I think there isn't a currency system, or yes, well, in Borderlands, for example, there is 100%. So it does have an economic system. The game does have an economic system which has a high degree of efficiency in terms of its integration within the gameplay mechanics, especially for a first-person shooter game. It's not as effective as, let's say, well, it's even more effective than Borderlands if we think about it, because in Borderlands, generally, money, in the first Borderlands. In the second one, the Iridium is more important to expand your storage deck and getting the best upgrades for the ammo and the clip. In that sense, it's like the Iridium in Borderlands 2. But in Borderlands 1, for example, basically with money, you expand, you can buy everything, and there's a point in which you reach 99999, and it doesn't make any sense because it doesn't drop the best weapons. So in that sense, I think it's a very positive point that the economic system remains relevant up until the end of the game. It remains relevant up until the end of the game. In that sense, it's pretty well designed. It's the crowning achievement of the economic system in that sense, that it remains relevant up until the end, and it's something that we don't usually see in first-person shooter games that generally don't even have an economic system. So in that sense, I like the abstract complexity, the high abstract complexity that it provides, the integration of that economic system. I love how diverse it is, how the resources of the game are very varied, and pretty much diverse in that sense, because they have a lot of variety. Because if you think about it, the health you don't have health regeneration, so Steam packs and health, they are resource by themselves. Like in Call of Duty, it's not a resource because you auto regenerate. You just have to worry about surviving instead of looting Steam packs. So in that sense, that's the first resource. The second one, while you don't have a stamina bar, sprinting is limited, and it's a way of getting out of, especially evading the zerglings that explode, explosive enemies. Or, for example, another thing that I forgot to mention is that some of the creatures do grab barrels, explosive barrels from the environment, and they throw it at you, and if you shoot them, kind of like when they're kind of like grabbing them and holding them up, they explode and deal area of effect damage. But if they throw it close to you and you shoot them, they explode kind of like in your face and on your face, and you take a heavy hit. So pretty much, the environment is perfectly integrated in that sense, and as I've said, sprinting is a second resource to avoid all of these things that I'm mentioning, but especially area of effect damage in the situations that I described. So pretty much, people, I will mention to you that sprinting is a second resource, especially in this game, in which combat is, as I've said, close up and personal, and you have to use it to evade a lot of enemy attacks. If it's a ranged game like in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, it wouldn't make much of a difference, because basically enemies are ranged and you are automatically targeted by them, and pretty much there are some ranged enemies in this game, but still. Third element would be the time manipulation orange bar that I mentioned. What I have already described to you, everything about it. Pretty much that third resource ensures that you have to deal with the special attacks, that you have to use it efficiently, intelligently, and it's crucial because it is needed to even deal damage to a lot of enemies, like as I've said, the invisible guys, the invisible Zex, the invisible creatures, the zombies, and everything. It's pretty much needed. It's also a pretty good counter against the Zerglings, as I've said. So good. And for example, the time manipulate the globe of energy, as I've said, the time manipulation energy field that you shoot, pretty much is needed to deal with the huge ultralisks, the huge beasts that you stumble upon by the end of the game. You have to kind of like stop time around them and then kill them with your most powerful weapon. So pretty much, and like that, they cannot defend. So the time manipulation device stays relevant as a resource as well throughout the whole of the game. I would say it's the most influential resource alongside, well, no, I would say that health is the most influential one, but second, well, no, it would be the time manipulation, because even if you are at 1 point of health, with the time, if you have enough time manipulation energy, you can still stop time around you and kill all of the creatures in it. Like, it's the most important one, as I said initially. I doubted about health being the other one, but no, it's definitely the time manipulation energy. It's the most OP. It's the most important resource that you need to master. So you have 3 resources that exponentially increases the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics by 3 times. In that sense, when compared to Call of Duty, remember, this is not an RPG game. We cannot compare it to the abstract complexity of a role-playing game, because the game is not designed to be that. It's not designed to provide that experience. So if we compare it to Bioshock or Dishonored, in that sense, it's a bit more balanced, because they have magic and manual health regeneration instead of automatic health regeneration like in Call of Duty. So in that sense, I would place the game's abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics higher than Call of Duty, in the same league as Bioshock and Dishonored, which would be 1 step above them, but it doesn't get to the abstract complexity of Borderlands, which would be the top, and the reason why Borderlands it's so amazing. In that sense, the abstract complexity is the highest possible in any FPS game ever, except for some specific cases like Metroid. Metroid could arguably be also quite complex, but still, it doesn't have a loot system behind it, Metroid, but it does have an upgrade system. So I would place Metroid between Bioshock, Dishonored, and Borderlands. It would be a bit higher. I would still say that Borderlands is the highest one out of all of them, because of the perfect integration of the RPG mechanics. Kind of like it objectively inherits elements that from a genre with much more abstract complexity of its gameplay mechanics, which is the real role-playing genre. In that sense, that's the objective reason why it has more abstract complexity, because it inherits more abstract complexity from a genre that is more complex by itself. Right, people. But still, Singularity, Bioshock, and Dishonored, they do have more complexity than Call of Duty, which it's kind of like, instead of being a bi-dimensional or multi-dimensional, instead of having a multi-dimensional economic system, as I mentioned, 3 elements: the stamina, the health, and the time manipulation, or in the case of Dishonored, the magic, the sprinting, and the health. Instead of those, Call of Duty is kind of like one-dimensional to put all of the focus on the quality of the linear story and the gameplay mechanics themselves. Alright. And it favors more ranged combat, contrary to all of these games that I mentioned. So pretty much I think with these 5 elements you have a pretty clear idea of what the game is about. I think I have extensively dissected and covered everything in this hour, as I usually like to do. So pretty much like that. I think in terms of elements, And in terms of enemy variety, I also covered it. There are some boss fights. Yeah, I have to mention that, but it's part of the level design. We'll take care of the boss fights or the lack of them in the level design. So in terms of the gameplay, in terms of the combat itself and how the game progressively unfolds in its combat mechanics and everything, the last thing that I should mention is that it also has ranged combat against the Soviet soldiers, which is the same as in Call of Duty. And when I say the same, it's the same. It's Call of Duty. It's clearly made by the same engine. You travel back and forth in time, and the aesthetics of the soldiers change, but the mechanics are the same. So in that sense, we have, well, it's true that we have the elite Soviet trooper with the minigun that uses the minigun, the same weapon that the player uses, and in that sense, sharing the weapons between the mobs and the player is always a positive thing, because you create a correlation between the weapons that enemies use and the player. In that sense, it's quite efficient, because for example in Borderlands, enemies don't use the same weapons as the player all the time, and it's much more complex in abstract terms, creating a system in which there's a direct correlation between the weapons that the player uses, regardless of the genre, and the weapons that the mobs use, or the resistances. I mentioned this in the final analysis of Sacred 2, for example. I explained it extensively. This is not an RPG game, so we're not getting into that. But still, the fact that here there's a correlation between the weapons that you use and the weapons that the Soviet soldiers use, and you can loot the ammo from them most of the time, to influence, as I've said, that choice that you have to make, that I mentioned previously, in terms of the skill tree, that you can choose getting the required ammo to progress through the game, or or upgrading the skill tree. So in that sense, the game is quite efficient at creating that high degree of efficiency in the integration of its elements. So, enemy variety, there's this elite Soviet trooper that I mentioned, and the rest of the mutated creatures. Weapon variety, I knew I was forgetting about something. Weapon variety would be the sixth element. Weapon variety, as I've said, 7 weapons. I mentioned something briefly, but still, the weapons are very defined, clearly defined, between short range and long range, like the Centurion and the shotgun. They are for short range. The game does inherit a flaw from Call of Duty, which is the fact that weapons are extremely precise, and when I say extremely precise, I say 100%. For example, you wouldn't need to aim down the sights, for example, due to how precise they are. Call of Duty has this as well. I mentioned it in its engine, and that basically makes long-ranged weapons underpowered, because, for example, you don't need the sniper rifle at all. I think I never used it in the game except when it was introduced in the tutorial portion of it. You don't need it at all because of how precise the minigun or the Valkyrie, the automatic rifle, is when aiming down the sights. Like, I don't like that in all Call of Duty games the automatic rifles replace sniper rifles by default. Like, weapons generally are so precise, they're so precise that it's unrealistic. Like, the crosshair is so precise that it's unrealistic in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1, 2, 3, Black Ops. But in those games it's needed, because you have endless spawns in terms of the level design. Like, they keep spawning, the enemies keep spawning until you reach a specific point, which makes the game extremely hard, especially if played on veteran, which isn't the case here. In the case of this game, it didn't need to have such precise weapons that replace the functionality of other weapons. But as for the rest, it is true that the shotgun and the pistol are for close range, and the sniper rifle, the the automatic rifle and the grenade launchers and etc. that I didn't even need to use. I finished the game using only the minigame. It's true that they kind of like overlap in their functionality. It is true that they overlap in their functionality. That is true, and I think that's a flaw. The overlapped functionality of the weapon variety. For example, I could finish the game only with I kind of like went straight for a fully upgraded minigun and an automatic rifle, and that pretty much destroyed the need of even ever using the sniper rifle, for example, or the grenade launcher, or the shotgun. Well, in that sense, the shotgun, since you don't have the minigun available at the beginning, it does play a role. The same goes for the pistol. They are kind of like, they do play a role, but late game weapons clearly were affected by the rushed development that usually all games have. I can no one can hide those details from me. In that sense, it's very difficult. I can see a bit of rushed development by the end. That is the very reason why the game has such few final boss has such few bosses. It doesn't even have final boss. And pretty much the reason why a lot of the late game weapons appear kind of like by the end of the game, like making no sense, and a lot of money by the end of the game. You get a lot of money that basically doesn't make sense. The economic system and the weapon variety of the end game of this game don't make sense because they are extremely abundant. There's a lot of them, but by that time, unless you reserved all of your tech points, it's impossible to upgrade them because the level design gets to the end. Pretty similar to what happened to Halo 2 by the end, but Halo 2 was much better managed in that sense because they designed all of the weapons. They provided all of the weapons to the player right way before the end, and there isn't an upgrade system that exposes this, for example. So in that sense, I can see that the rush development affected the functionality of the endgame weapon variety system of the game and the economic system of the game, because there are clear choke points in the game in which you go from looting early game money amounts, let's say early game money with a totally different amount of money of currency when compared to the mid game and the end game. In that sense, they are clearly split. Like, I could perfectly identify while playing the game, let's say, the early game income currency, mid game income currency sections, and late game income currency sections. I could perfectly identify it when it goes up from taking 4 hours the early game, the entirety of the early game, 4 hours to get, I don't know, 5,000 E99 energy, and in the mid game you can get it by only in half an hour of gameplay, or a whole hour of gameplay, an hour or an hour and a half of gameplay. So by the end of the game, you'll have a lot of money. The upgrades that I mentioned at the Augmentor also gradually upgrade in price, so they wanted to specifically block some of them in order just so the player isn't OP. But still, I think that except for some 2 or 3 choke points, you won't have any problem beating this game if you played Call of Duty on Veteran or Dishonored or whatever. They are much more difficult, that's for sure. So at the end of the day, the difficulty does get distorted and does suffer a hit, but well, until the magician runs out of tricks, you get a good experience, you get a good journey throughout, I would say, 70% of the game, especially the early game, and the beginning of the mid game. It gradually degrades in that sense, which is always negative. But well, it is clear that they did everything they could to stop that degradation of the balance between the economic system and the weaponry system of the game and the overall gameplay mechanics and the overall combat. they did everything they could to delay that degradation of the balance between all of those integrated elements of the gameplay mechanics. So in that sense, good. In that sense, could have been better. Always, well, not always. It could have been definitely better. I can definitely see the cracks and the flaws in the gameplay, but the core experience is definitely solid. Solid core experience, but it gradually degrades as you play the game. So it's always negative that when the game doesn't pose a challenge by the end of the game, and that will be related to another element that I will mention when we get to the level design, which is the lack of bosses. The lack of bosses, that's, for me, that's absolutely terrible. That's, I think, it's the most negative element that the game inherits from Call of Duty, for example. So good. So in terms of the gameplay mechanics, pretty well executed. I don't... the core is good, but as I've said, it gradually degrades. I think I covered all of the aspects, from the enemy variety, from the weapon variety, to how the combat works. The heavy impact animation, for example, I forgot about this. One of the weapons that I didn't use at all introduces a mechanic from Sniper Elite. It's a slight detail, but in case you like Sniper Elite, they copied the mechanic from Sniper Elite, in case you don't know. Sniper Elite is a pretty amazing... It's a pretty amazing FPS game that introduces a mechanic in which you can manipulate the trajectory of your bullet with your mouse. It's an amazing game. It's the same as... It's developed by the same team, which is Rebellion Games. The same team behind the Zombie Army trilogy, Zombie Army 1, 2, and 3. Amazing games. I highly recommend all of them. All of the Sniper Elite series and all of the Zombie Army trilogy series. They got a fourth one released. Tetralogy then. Good. So yeah, it does have some quirky mechanics from other games of the genre. So if you like Sniper Elite, there's a weapon that you can use, but you cannot upgrade it. You cannot refill the ammo of it, so it's very, very limited in that sense. So I don't recommend using that weapon, but if you want to play it like in Sniper Elite, if you are careful with your ammo, perhaps you can do it. So weapons don't vary. They don't vary throughout the game like you would do in Call of Duty, that when you start a new chapter, which the game does have kind of like a few chapter transitions, they don't change. You retain your weapons all the time. You can change your weapons over at these weapon stations that I mentioned in the fourth point of the gameplay element of the analysis. You can change your weapons. You can use different weapons in case you run out of ammo. So it's another excuse for not running out of ammo, because even if you don't have money, you can change to other weapon and it will retain the ammo that you had originally for that one. So and that you progressively loot throughout the game. So they ensure that it's a first-person shooter action game with horror elements in its environment, but that doesn't change the genre, sorry, because there's no ammo scarcity. As I've said, the key point doesn't have ammo scarcity, and it doesn't have an unbalanced gameplay. It's completely balanced in that sense. It favors the player, I would say, even. So it's action-packed in that sense. We can clearly define the game as an action FPS games. Those who mention the survival horror genre, I am sorry, completely wrong. There aren't any objective elements that justify that classification, because the first thing that you need to have is ammo scarcity, and this game doesn't have ammo scarcity, even if it has horror elements. Having some jump scares doesn't make the game change its genre. It's absolutely irrelevant to the core gameplay mechanics in that sense. So good. I think we've covered all of the gameplay in this hour and a half. I always say that I'm not going to extend the analysis a lot, and I always end up get lost in thought. I get caught up with with all of the special things, with all of the details that the game has. So it has some special weapons. That, for example, the weapon that uses that sniper elite mechanic, you cannot get ammo, so it's pretty relevant in my eyes, 100%. So yeah, in case maybe you can do a walkthrough of that with that weapon, but well. Alright, I think it was a good inclusion. They included that perfectly, and we've already covered time manipulation device and everything. Pretty good. By the end of the game, you get unlimited time manipulation energy, but it's just the last 5 minutes of gameplay, pretty much. So you don't have to worry about that. You still have to spend points upgrading your time manipulation energy. So good. I think I covered everything. The best boss fight of the game, which is the first one, so enjoy it deeply, is the best one against a variation of these mutated creatures that I said, the sex that they teleport and that they are invulnerable when they are invisible. The first boss fight of the game, I think, is the best design one. They should have gone. I would have been happy if they revived that enemy, made it stronger, and used it as a final boss fight. The game doesn't have a final boss fight, but in that sense, the gameplay mechanics of that boss fight, they are pretty well designed because they expand upon the mechanics of the sex, which I think are the best designed out of all of them, because they grab the barrels, they become invisible, they have a pretty erratic behavior that not erratic, very varied behavior that encourages gameplay complexity at its finest. So good. The first boss fight is the best. I'll mention that once we get to the level design. So I think I covered everything in terms of the combat. The game doesn't have a stealth like Dishonored at all. Though some enemies are kind of like blind and you can, I don't know, you can try to take them out with melee attacks, but at the end of the day you cannot sneak past sections. There's some environmental damage that you can deal with electricity by degrading, for example, an electricity panel and electrocuting all of the zombies in the water, for example. Something along those lines, but still nothing that has a heavy influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics regarding combat. Like Bioshock introduced that previously, but it was a recurrent element. Here is not that much. I think I only saw it twice in the whole gameplay, which is not significant at all. Alright, you can shoot low, well, whatever. Pretty much, that's pretty much everything. We've dissected every element of the gameplay. The animation, the bullet animations are the same as in Call of Duty. They're perfectly done, especially when you shoot enemies inside of the time manipulation TL bubble. You can see how the bullets go in slow motion and how they impact slowly on the enemy. That's pretty well designed because you can shoot them and you can strafe to the left or the right, and you can see all of the bullets kind of like in their trajectory to impacting the enemy. That's pretty well done. And then when you get out of the bubble, boom, it pops and the enemy is automatically dead. That, in that sense, is pretty well done, that effect. Good. I think we covered everything in terms of the gameplay mechanics. So that's my favorite thing to do in this game, basically. Well, you can jump, but it's useless, pretty much. I think I covered all the enemy gameplay variety, pretty much. I think it's everything. Objectively, you could see all of the implicacies of combat and its different variations. I think I don't forget about anything, any weapon, the grenade launcher. No, pretty much no. No, I think I thoroughly covered, dissected all of the elements of the gameplay mechanics with all of the enemies that you can stumble upon. There's a small section by the end in which you not by the end, in the mid-game mechanics, in which you chase after a character called Catherine, and you have to ensure that you don't that the Soviets don't kidnap her. In that sense, but still, that's nothing that significantly affects the gameplay mechanics. We've covered everything. You have to grab the steam packs, and you have to loot all of your ammo and everything that is scattered around the terrain. Your steam packs, your time manipulation steam packs that are not health steam packs. So yeah, pretty much I think I covered everything. All enemy types, everything. You have to shoot. There are some infrared mutated bulbs that you have to age in order to prevent them from spawning more zerglings. That's a small mechanic, but nothing relevant. There are some some sections in which you have to check your oxygen because you have to go underwater, but they don't affect the combat. You cannot fight in underwater, and yeah, pretty much. You can also shoot some barrels that freeze enemies, and deal area of effect damage. So in that sense, environmental damage is much more relevant with those, with explosive barrels and frozen barrels. I knew I was forgetting about something. In that sense, it's an influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics that is perfectly implemented. That's always a positive. So yeah, let's get into the second aspect of the analysis. The game has a frame rate cap of 120 FPS, which it's inherited from the engine of Call of Duty. I think they all had that hard cap of 120 FPS initially, though not since Modern Warfare 1, because I remember Call of Duty 2 had unlocked frame rates at 144, but ironically, due to limitations of the 7th generation, presumably, Modern Warfare 1, the original, Black Ops, and this one, and Singularity, they have the limit of 120 FPS. I think Advanced Warfare has a limitation of 90. They don't get to 144, but they are roughly there. So in that sense, 120 FPS is more than enough for this game to be battery smooth. Let's get into the gameplay category of the analysis. The game is battery smooth. The weapons animations are amazing. They're all customized. So what they lack in terms of variety of weapons, they do compensate with the amazing animations. I love how, for example, the automatic rifle, the Valkyrie, there's kind of like a hamster, something like a cog, like a hamster wheel, kind of like always rotating when you shoot enemies, and it gradually stops. Pretty well executed. Reflections on weapons are extremely well done. All of the effects related to the time manipulation energy are gallantly executed. Pretty old school phrase there. They are gallantly executed. In a very elegant way. They have pretty good animations. The textures, a lot of 2D textures, even in this game. For example, inside of the glasses of some machines, it's difficult to describe. The time energy, which is represented in orange, has a high resolution in that sense, so it has pretty good frame rate, 120 FPS limit. It has unlocked resolutions, of course. It goes all the way up to 2K at least, and I bet it also reaches 4K. But there's one criticism, which is that the highly detailed textures for weapons and their reflections that are amazingly well done, we don't get those amazing high resolution textures regarding the environment. In the environment, like, they clearly inherit the engine of Call of Duty, and those games were notoriously, originally before the remasters, they were notoriously bad for that time of having very, very muddy textures for the multiplayer to work flawlessly, and so it was so smooth for everyone. And before anyone says, well, but back in the day it looked gorgeous, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1. No, trust me, there were, for example, Battlefield looked much better, even though Call of Duty was a better game. But it did have those muddy textures. It always had those muddy textures. For example, you can see it in the first stream when I was at the pier, like at that harbor at the beginning, in which The textures for the ropes were terrible. The ground textures were also terrible. In that sense, the textures of the game, of the environment, are bad, but for the weapons they are good. So it's a mixed bag. But as for the rest, we cannot continue without highlighting the amazing special effects that the game has. In that sense, for example, the sequence in which the fairy begins to get all destroyed because of the influence of the time manipulation energy is done in a pretty amazing way, because you can see how it slowly, how the walls of the ship slowly get deteriorated, and they become all rusty, for example, and you can see how they slowly get rusted because of that time manipulation influence, of that time manipulation energy influence, that they kind of like continuously get rusted. The walls around you as you play through the game with your gun, the walls get progressively rusty. They get rusted as you walk through a corridor, for example, inside of the ship. That was pretty well done. All of the time manipulation effects are pretty well done, from explosions, from transitions, from the bomb that by the end of the game you are carrying to save everyone. So it's perfectly executed. All of the effects related to the time manipulation, they are amazing. Related to your powers that you use throughout all of the game, they are amazing. In that sense, I cannot complain at all. All of the care that they didn't put in the environment, in upgrading the environment, they used it for the textures of the weapons and the textures of the time manipulation abilities, for example. So yeah, pretty much perfectly executed, and I highly appreciate that. Good. Unlock resolution, 120 and 20 FPS limit, pretty amazing, considering the game was released back in 2010. Though Call of Duty 2 had unlocked frame rates, in that sense, they were ahead of its time. That game was ahead of its time, that's why I love it so much. So in terms of the textures, mixed bag. Special effects, amazing. Special effects are amazing. The heavy impacts of the bullet animations, they are amazing, like in Gears of War. In that sense, Gears of War has lost those heavy animations that, for example, those heavy impact animations of the bullets. This game represents them perfectly, like the first Gears of War, like Killzone from back in the day, like Resistance, like all of those amazing FPS games from the 7th generation. This game is absolutely amazing. For example, in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, you just see kind of like a blood animation kind of like spilling like this into the air, and here is much more detailed. And I'll get into that right now because this is the key point of the technical aspect of the game. There's another game that Raven Software developed, but for those of you who have been watching the series, you'll know that what game it is, because I have mentioned it. It's X-Men Origins Wolverine, the movie tie-in, that, contrary to what most people believe, the modern version for PC especially, developed by Raven Software, which was their previous work. Not only it's an amazing hack and slash game that I highly recommend if you like God of War 3, for example, or Darksiders, but not only that, Singularity uses the complex body textures of X-Men Origins Wolverine for the zombies in this game. And you must be thinking, what does it have to do with Eraser? It sounds extremely stupid. It is not. It is not. Because if you play X-Men Origins Wolverine, you'll realize that, for example, the regeneration texture animation of Wolverine in that game, it's probably the most complex ever created. The subsurface scattering effect, the best subsurface scattering effect ever created. By that I mean, for example, when subsurface scattering effect is, for example, when the bullets hit a wall, that you see the impact animation. In this case, it's on the body. So in that game, you can see kind of like the fiber, the individual fibers of the skin of Wolverine with several layers of tissue, of skin tissue. It has kind of like a multi-layered subsurface scattering system implemented on Wolverine, which is absolutely amazing. I think it's only on the PC version of it. I don't know about the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And you can clearly see it in the PC version. In that sense, the game is amazing because of that, because when Wolverine gets it, they ensure that Raven Software ensures that when Wolverine gets attacked by, I don't know, a helicopter, Hellfire missile, or some shit like that, that it gets through him, and it pretty much, you can see the different layers of subsurface scattering skin tissue. It's extremely complex to explain. I've showcased it, but basically the skin of Wolverine slowly regenerates, and you can see the layers kind of like completing the regeneration process. So in that sense, they applied all of their knowledge with that, with the protagonist of our previous game. They applied it to the impact animation of the zombies, the bullet impact animations on the zombies that we do in this FPS game. So you can see, I could clearly see the same layers of subsurface scattering textures perfectly implemented on the zombies that I would be constantly killing and shooting. It does feature head explosions when you target the head, so it's pretty amazing, just like in Gears of War. In that sense, Gears of War had a pretty amazing system as well. But I would say that the subsurface scattering effect of Wolverine by Raven Software is the best, and they should always implement it in all of their games, because it's an exclusive signature of this studio that we need to always highlight. So in that sense, the technical aspect of the game, it's almost impeccable. It does have the flow of inheriting the muddy textures of Call of Duty. And no, even back in the day, even back in 2010, there were games that if you play them on Ultra, on PC, had better inherent textures to them. Even Bioshock, even Battlefield 3, for example, especially Battlefield 3, and pretty much they fixed those muddy textures problem. Good. So besides that, the fact that they inherited the most complex subsurface scattering system for human tissue, pretty much in this case they used for zombie tissue, but it's the same. They handled it pretty well. Makes for an amazing detail that, as I've said, is a huge contrast looking at the textures of that complex system with the muddy textures of some of the environment system. The bloom and the lighting, they are pretty well executed. And the technical aspect of the game definitely helps the eerie atmosphere that I will talk about in the Grandeur category of the analysis, in the storyline and the ambience and the soundtrack impact on the player. But the technical aspect of it, it's definitely it definitely fulfills a pivotal role that is the one responsible for enhancing the ambience, the eerie ambience of the game, with all of the sounds of the zombies and everything. It has amazing 3D positional audio, this game. I could clearly distinguish between my left and my right 3D environment directions. In that sense, remember that I use a 3D sound system in my setup that enhances that if the game does have it, and I can clearly see which game does have that and which one doesn't. So I could clearly spot it in this game. The same as in Call of Duty, they always had amazing 3D sound. So pretty amazing. The technical aspect of the game, it's absolutely amazing, except for the muddy textures. That is a negative flaw. That, as well as the ones that I mentioned in the gameplay mechanics, it does have some cracks and defects that you can clearly see. Just as I criticize the rush development by the end in terms of the gameplay mechanics and the fact that you don't have a lot of weapon variety as I would have liked. Just like that, I have to admit that except for the muddy textures, the technical aspect is good. Very well, let's get into the third element of the analysis, which is also quite important, which is the level design. The level design, people. Especially in this game, let me begin by prefacing the obvious, which is the fact that the time manipulation gameplay mechanics of this game do have an influence on the level design, which open up the possibility for Portal-like puzzles, similar to Half-Life. There are some sections in which the player will definitely be stuck. Definitely. There are some interactive elements that are extremely recycled in this game. They are kind of like crates, as I described at the beginning of the review, that you can degrade. You can make them age, and because of that they are flat, and you place them right behind an iron curtain or something, and then you, for example, with your time manipulation device, you make them rejuvenate, let's say, and restore the former shape of said crate, and like that you open the curtain by placing. It's kind of like half opened. Imagine an iron curtain half opened, and you place the flat crate and then the aged flat crate, and then you restore it with the time manipulation device, and it pushes the iron curtain up. For example, that's the most notorious one that I can remember off the top of my head. But there are also other elements, other puzzles that involve, for example, there's by the end of the game, there's a section in which you rely on oxygen, and you have to stop the time. It's actually the only one that I had to look up by the end of the game, while playing, in which you have to activate a door and stop time right before getting through it. Is another iron curtain, it's not a door. So pretty much things like that, they are related to the time manipulation gameplay mechanics that we described at the beginning of the analysis in terms of the combat and their interaction. As I've said, you can also manipulate the environment to erect some small cement walls that act as cover points for you, and you can degrade those same cover points for your enemies. Generally useful when you are going up against the Soviet soldiers, ranged enemies, though most of the time you'll go up against melee enemies. But it doesn't matter, because you can also, for example, the most influential level design mechanic that I mentioned in the gameplay briefly, the explosive barrels and the frozen barrels that you can kind of like attract to you. You can grab them from far away and throw them at enemies. In that sense, they're strategically placed so the player can grab them and attack enemies with them. Another way of substituting an occasional lack of ammo that anyways doesn't happen in this game. There is an ammo scarcity, and as I've said, it's one of the crowning achievements to balance the gameplay mechanics in a game in which most enemies are melee. So in that sense, just as I mentioned in the gameplay portion of the analysis, which is definitely the core of it, the level design perfectly complements the gameplay, the combat gameplay mechanics that the game offers to the player. You can grab those explosive barrels, you can shoot explosive barrels as the creatures leave the map, and if you shoot them there, it will deal area of effect damage to all of them. The same if they get to throw them at you and you shoot the explosive barrel close to you, and it will deal a high amount of damage to you. So in that sense, the high degree of efficiency of integration of the environment of the level design with the gameplay mechanics is something to be congratulated, to be appreciated by us, by us players. And as for the rest, not only creates puzzles, but the long-lasting influence of those puzzles on the economic system of the game is also something that we have to mention, because generally puzzles, these small puzzles that I have been mentioning, for example, shooting a lock, or I don't know, using the crate to open a door, or something like that, all of those puzzle elements through the time manipulation system of the game that affect the level design of the environment, they are crucial to access the time manipulation device blueprints, to access the blueprints that will unlock the abilities of the skill tree, for example. So as you can see, the level design has a huge influence on the game, on the upgrade system and the economic system of the game, because you also loot not only the blueprints but tech points for the weapons and E99 energy. You can restore, for example, you can restore, let's say concealed aged elements of the environment. For example, a broken crate, you can rejuvenate it, you can restore it, and while it was destroyed, you can restore it by reverting the time, by making it age back. And inside of it there will be, for example, steam packs. That's another interaction that I think it was brilliantly executed. So the time manipulation gameplay mechanics do play a role in the level design as well, and the level design perfectly integrates the gameplay mechanics. In that sense, there's a high degree of efficiency of both elements of the analysis that I always pay a lot of attention to. Pretty ingenious puzzle segments, pretty similar to Portal in that sense. The game gets to feel very similar to Portal at some points, not all of the time. Definitely they are very well measured. They don't want to they definitely don't want to destroy the they definitely want to destroy they definitely don't want to destroy the action portion of the gameplay mechanics. So in that sense it's pretty well done. It's pretty well done. As for the rest of the level design, getting into the pure level design element of the game, how do I put it? The game is extremely linear. First of all, it inherits the level design of Call of Duty as the second element of the level design. It's extremely linear, the pure level design element. It's not like Metroid. This is something that I criticized. It doesn't need to be open world like Borderlands, or Just Cause, or Far Cry. I mentioned this in the final day of analysis. It doesn't have an open world map for you to explore. They're all narrow passages, which contribute to the perfect influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics, because when you have narrow passages and most enemies are engaged in melee, you don't have a lot of room to maneuver and escape. In that sense, it's a very positive element for this game, the same as Metroid and Bioshock with Rapture. They are all kind of like narrow corridors, and they serve a very specific purpose, which is the fact that the player cannot endlessly run away. In that sense, enemy detection range is pretty good in this game. They will chase you down, and you cannot. And since you have a limited amount of sprinting time, you cannot get away easily. So that, combined with the fact that the game does feature narrow corridors and the player cannot endlessly run away, the influence of the level design is extremely efficient. The game's atmosphere feels oppressive, partly because of these narrow corridors, besides the rest of the elements that I'll highlight later. So narrow, very narrow level design, that ensures that the player will always feel cornered by the zombies, by the teleporting enemies, by the huge ultralisks, and even the Soviet troopers. So in that sense, narrow corridors. There are narrow corridors, and the player doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver. I always say this, people, and I mentioned it in my final analysis of Havencast Rise of the Mage, and I always say thank you to the main level designer of Havencast Rise of the Mage from Austria for that they that they designed a pretty good influence, because you also don't have a lot of room to maneuver and escape narrow corridors in that game. So, and there are many more examples, but definitely Singularity follows that trend and perfectly executes it. In that sense, when the level design of a game properly influences the gameplay mechanics, in layman terms, the fact that you cannot escape the melee zombies that were purposely designed like that easily because of the narrow corridors, you generally are looking at a good game, because it has a high degree of efficiency of the integration of its different elements, and in that sense Singularity does that. So very, very positive in that sense. The fact that you cannot run away, very narrow corridors, and extremely linear. That would be a negative normally, but they inherited the engine of Call of Duty, and being linear is a valid design choice. It doesn't need to be open world. A game doesn't need to be open world at all. So what I criticized regarding this point is the fact that they could have kept the narrow corridors and all of the oppressive atmosphere and everything, and this perfect influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. They could have kept all of that. But they could have added backtracking. It doesn't need to be open world, but they could have added backtracking, and it would have been a huge benefit for this game. It would have been perfect, because it would have made it extremely similar to Bioshock. Well, in Dishonored, they are kind of like specific scenarios, it doesn't have a lot of backtracking. And it would have made it similar to Metroid Prime, basically. To Metroid Prime, which is probably one of the best level designs of all time. In terms of first-person shooter games, in first-person shooter games, it's the best. In games, in general, it's also one of the best, I would say. So, I would have added backtracking, and well, but for that they would have needed a lot more. With more budget, they would have added backtracking, an interconnected, not open world game. They should have kept the narrow passages in that sense, and they could have potentially kept the narrow passages in that sense. So keep the narrow passages, but add backtracking, something that encourages player exploration in a different way than just puzzles. That would have added a lot of gameplay variety that would have benefited the game greatly. So backtracking, keeping the narrow level design, would have been the ideal solution. It doesn't need to be open world. This game definitely doesn't have the idea or the philosophy to be open world, and it's perfectly fine in that sense. So backtracking would have replaced that. And as for the rest, the other aspect that they could have added besides backtracking would have been some extra game mode, because the game only has a story, which is perfectly fine. It's relatively long for an FPS game developed back in 2010. It's not as long as Call of Duty 2, for example, because the difficulty is what enhances it. That's another huge flaw that I wanted to highlight. The fact that since this game, the second you reach 70% of progression, roughly, the game becomes way too easy, and that degrades replayability. Just like I mentioned in my analysis of a split second, for example. So they could have added, I would have added a randomized kind of like roguelike mode, keeping the narrow passages, never open world, because this game doesn't have to be like that. So pretty much a roguelike mode would have been amazing. And you must be thinking, Eraser, that's a modern concept. We don't have roguelike. We didn't have roguelike level design games back in the 7th generation. Well, first of all, they could have added the backtracking of Metroid, which was developed in the 6th generation for the GameCube. Let's suppose that we don't have backtracking and we add the roguelike elements. That is not entirely true. There's a game on the PSP called Bounty Hounds, the first one, which does have randomly generated levels, for example, and that enhances replayability. And it was developed before this game. And there are other examples, like not only Bounty Hounds, but for example Warframe. I think it was developed after this game, but pretty much it's an MMORPG. I know it's third person and everything, but it does have FPS and third person shooter, and it does have that component. Pretty much. What they did was they added multiplayer in that sense, which could have been a valid solution. It was a solution back in the day, but here we can see once again how multiplayer, the same goes for Split Second, how online-only multiplayer completely destroys replayability because the servers eventually close, and the game's that portion of the game is lost forever. In that sense, the most valid solution, discarding the other two that I mentioned, changing the level design to add backtracking, and changing or adding a roguelike mode, which is, well, let's suppose it was extremely complex for 2010, and that they wanted to rely on multiplayer. Good, perfect, there's a solution for that. Add offline multiplayer against extremely polished bots like Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. The Xbox 360 version, I think it has offline multiplayer against bots, which are amazingly well done, and it also has zombies mode. That's the point. How is it possible that in terms of the level design, in terms of the replayability, I always mention these people, replayability has it plays a crucial role, because replayability enhances the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics, and the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics enhances the longevity of the game. And when you extend the longevity of a game, when you add replayability, you ensure that game's psychological impact on the player's mind has a lingering effect. We generally remember those games that last a lot of time. We all remember Borderlands, but very few people will remember Singularity because of this. It's the very same reason why RPGs are generally the most remembered genre out of all of them, and why sadly RTS is not remembered. Poor genre is my favorite one, in case you're wondering. So yes, that's the very reason. A lengthy offline campaign, but just like, for example, Warhammer Space Marine 2 did recently, it does feature randomized offline scenarios that are amazing. And this game, inheriting all of the engine of Call of Duty, inheriting all of the development experience of Call of Duty, they should have just added offline zombies instead against the mutated creatures with their exclusive gameplay mechanics of this game in a zombies-esque survival mode, and it would have exponentially enhanced the replayability of Singularity. The game doesn't have a zombie mode. You don't like that? Add offline multiplayer against bots. The ideal solution would have been the same as Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, that has offline against bots and offline multiplayer and offline zombies mode, which are both amazingly perfectly done. And it also has Exo Survival, which is a special mode. So we can see there how Call of Duty Advanced Warfare introduced the Exo Survival mode, which is exclusive to that game. You basically go up against soldiers. It's kind of like basically endless survival. Any endless survival or multiplayer or offline multiplayer against bots would have helped greatly in extending the replayability of the game. They had the experience, they had all of the inherited assets, they had everything, and it would have preserved the legacy of this game. Once again, a great mistake that all FPS games from this period of time made. Because basically, the game could have had the same replayability potential, as any other Call of Duty game, preserving its legacy and extending that psychological sense of progression on the player. In that sense, I want to highlight, especially as I said, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, and on PC you can have Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, Black Ops 3, World War II, Black Ops 4, and Cold War. All of those, fortunately, the PC community has corrected those disgusting issues of not having offline multiplayer against bots and offline zombies mode. Fortunately, the PC community has modded them in a way that they can launch the servers and you can play those modes offline. But back in the day, also Black Ops 1 was modified to have offline zombies, and that alone would have, with the fame of zombies mode of Black Ops 1, that this game would have been extremely similar. It would have made for an incredible experience. So in that sense, the level design has a huge replayability flaw that could have been easily addressed if this wasn't a game made with the engine of Call of Duty and all of the assets of Call of Duty Black Ops 1, which is the game that notoriously created the legendary zombies mode for all games and pretty much popularized survival as a whole. And this game was developed by a different internal development studio, but the same company, but inside of the same company, with all of the assets, with everything at their disposal to do it. I bet they had a limited budget, but still, they could have used a portion of that. It would have been better to hurt the story, making it even shorter, by making the main campaign even shorter, but add the zombies mode. The game would have had a long-lasting legacy that could have provided the funds and the interest in the player community to go for a sequel, to create a sequel. But this is exactly what happens, just like what happened with Warhammer Space Marine, the first one on PC, and I think it's the same as on consoles. You have survival mode, not only PvP, you have offline survival mode, and because of that, the second Warhammer Space Marine was recently released as well, because it gave the community an element, besides the amazing campaign that it had originally. I played it back in the day. It gave the player community an element, so it stays relevant throughout time, even well after the game has been forgotten. So it's a great addition that this thing could have easily had, considering it had all of the assets of Call of Duty, all of the development philosophy, everything. It would have been extremely easy to add a zombies mode, at least a zombies mode, against all of the pretty perfectly designed zombie and mutated creatures that the game introduces that are different when compared to Call of Duty. That would have been the saving key point in terms of the replayability and the long-lasting impact of the legacy of this game. So another huge flaw. So as you can see, all of the categories have a flaw. all of the categories so far do have a flaw. Something that I couldn't find, for example, in Sacred 2 or Split Second. In that sense, Split Second didn't have any flaw in terms of the gameplay, only in the replayability. In that sense, it has flaws on every single category, even if the core gameplay mechanics are well executed. And in terms of the level design, one last element that I wanted to highlight is that generally, as I've said, you have two ways. One is the correct way, and the other one is kind of like an extra way to find some goodies, to find some extra cash, some extra tech points, some extra elements to improve your skill tree. So in that sense, they are kind of like always extremely well defined. Well, you have to choose, and if you choose the wrong way and you wanted to get some extra cash, for example, there's generally a door that will close behind you. It kind of like has a preclusive system that blocks your backtracking ability in very limited sections, so you can go back and grab the goodies, very similar to Gears of War, something like that. So they're just two defined ways, and pretty much very, very linear. You can always tell that you only have two paths, and one of them is just to get some extra cash. As I've said, the most positive influence is how that extra in-game currency that you get has two uses that will influence the decision-making psychology of the player. The extra money that you get, the extra in-game energy that you get, can be used for both getting ammo that perhaps you need, or upgrading your skill tree in that sense. So it encourages the player to improve the skill tree through efficiently looting the ammo and slowly exploring the environment. In that sense, it's the best element that I could spot, how well the level design influences the economic system of the game, which in turn also has a long-lasting impact because you have to gradually build your skill tree, and you could potentially fuck up. You could potentially ruin your skill tree, but in that sense, the influence of the level design on the economic system is pretty well executed. It's a very positive element, but as for the rest, it's not a flaw, people, that a game is extremely linear in that sense. It's an absolutely perfectly fine and acceptable answer. So it's okay. I should have, but as I've said, if you are going to go that route, make sure to enhance the replayability as much as you can. And in this case, specifically in this case, there was definitely no excuse to not to enhance the replayability. Even if you have a limited budget, 100%. Even make the story shorter. They could have gone for making the campaign shorter and just grab 1, 2, or 3 scenarios like in Call of Duty Black Ops the zombies. It cannot be that costly creating that, because you recycle the environments, you recycle the enemy designs. You just have to organize the level design, the waves, and providing the player with some things to survive for some minutes and expand upon that base, like in Call of Duty Black Ops the zombies mode. So in that sense, the lack of a zombies mode is with the creatures, with the time manipulation mutated creatures, with the time mutated creatures of this game, it's absolutely a terrible flaw, a terrible level design flaw, and they did have I am 98% sure that they had the budget, because the story of the game drags on perhaps a bit more than it should. Like the last segment, I barely stumble upon any enemies, and 100% they could have used all of that by cutting the end of the story and using it to create that. One other critical flaw that I saw is that, except for the first boss fight, as I've said, the first boss fight was perfectly executed. Except for the first boss fight, there are 2 more boss fights. One in which you just have to aim your crosshair without even shooting a giant creature on screen that makes a brief appearance by the end of the mid-game gameplay mechanics. You don't even have to shoot, it's all very automatic. Then you have a small fight, but in which you shoot some weak spots, pretty similar to Chromarax the Invincible, but without all of the amazing mechanics of it, because it's a fixed. The creature you're fighting kind of like on top of a train, and it's a, and you cannot, like, you can barely move. There's no movement by the player. It's kind of like just, it feels like an on rails shooter, like Star Fox. So an on rails shooter fight that is not even on rails because you don't move. A static shooting fight is terrible. The lack of bosses in this game is absolutely terrible. You never go up against crazy mutated bosses that allow for the player to interact with the environment and make use of the time manipulation mechanics. In that sense, only the first boss fight, I think, is the best designed out of all of them. There aren't a lot. There isn't a final boss fight in this game. Something that, for me, not having a final boss fight, it's kind of like you don't need to have a crazy secret final boss like Chromarax the Invisible in Borderlands. Not having a final hard boss fight with all of the crazy time manipulation gameplay mechanics that I mentioned, it's an absolute wasted opportunity. We don't get the replayability of having an endless survival zombie mode, and we don't get a final boss fight, but we still get a kind of like a half-baked story. In that sense, there's no way to justify that. The lack of a final boss, for me, it's an absolute critical flaw. I think because it's an essential component of not only game design, not only level design and game design in general, but the lack of a final boss, it's kind of like a violation of Gamers Code 101. I don't know if you get what I mean. Let's get into the objective matter, because otherwise I'm just giving you a stupid subjective explanation with a joke. The psychological impact on the player is objectively much worse. It's objectively much worse the second you take out the ancestral, the ancient element of the gaming industry of having boss fights. Why? Because the boss fight by itself, it's an integral element of video games as an art, right? Because it's one of the defining elements that separates video games from movies. See that there's an objective metaphysical explanation, that it doesn't have to do with my mental perception. Why? Because in a video game, the player takes something called a psychological active role, while in a movie, the audience takes a passive role. You are watching a protagonist, just like with a book, just like with, I don't know, a comic, just like with a series, a TV show, just like in a TV show, the audience takes a passive role. And that's a huge difference, because you watch the protagonist of your story, or the antagonist, or whatever, get through challenges. It's the basic premise of any book or story. I know that all of this sounds way too essential and basic. It's the basic. There has to be a premise and an initial situation, a conflict, and a resolution. That's the basic structure of any book or movie or story since the dawn of time. And the protagonist has to progressively get through those conflicts and achieve, or not, the objective of his motivations, of his purpose, right? That's the basic premise. In the case of video games, the player takes an active role even if the story it's in third person in the sense that except it's an RPG game in which you develop your own character, which would be more kind of like personal. In the case of these games, you like The Witcher, for example, or in The Legend of Zelda. In the case of Link, it's a well-established character, beating the original purpose of being an RPG. In that sense, and I do love that they made that decision. It's very similar to The Witcher in that sense. In that sense, Captain Renko, who is the protagonist here, and we play in first person, and we don't see him, just like in Halo. There's an explanation for that because they want to make the player feel that everyone is Master Chief. For example, this was explained at some point, or with Gordon Freeman in Half-Life. In that sense, video games are in video games the player takes an active role, and because of that, it is essential that just like in a movie the main character has to progress through trials or conflicts, the player gets through conflicts, right? I know it's extremely essential and basic what I'm mentioning, but it justifies why it is a critical flaw not to have a lot of not having a final boss and not having bosses throughout the game, not enough bosses throughout the game. Because getting through a tough boss fight, you can see this perfectly in Dark Souls or Metroid Prime, just to use an FPS game with a first-person camera game that has those amazing, huge alien bosses. Just like that, the fact that you don't have those obstacles to overcome anymore by not having a final boss, by not having enough bosses, it destroys the psychological sense of progression for the player. It completely destroys it. Not having a big bad final boss, it's a critical flaw. And you must be thinking, but Eraser, Call of Duty doesn't have crazy mutated final bosses. It doesn't even have final boss fights. That is not the case at all. That is not the case at all. Because while Call of Duty doesn't have kind of like one big bad mutated creature as the final boss, the final level in Call of Duty World at War, that's why I want to showcase it eventually, the frontline assault on the Rage Palace, the final level of Call of Duty World at War, it's so excruciatingly difficult and brutal that feels like a final boss, even if the physical embodiment of the concept of the abstract concept of final boss is not only one enemy, but they you know how they work in that level design is majestically, it's perfectly done, one of the best of all time, if not the best. The enemies constantly spawn in waves that are endless until the player physically reaches a specific point, and the spawn frequency, just like in Call of Duty 2, is the crowning achievement of the series in that sense. They continuously spawn, and they just increase the frequency of that spawn. They increase the spawn frequency of those soldiers that attack you. In that sense, it's perfectly executed, and it should have been used in this game even more. That same philosophy in this game is used when you rescue Dr. Varesov in the laboratory by the end of the early gameplay, by the end of the first stream, for example, of the second one, if I fraction them over at YouTube. No, yeah, of the first stream, I generally don't fraction the first one. So pretty much, they could have simply used that endless spawning mechanic until the player reaches a certain point as a final boss fight, and that would have saved it completely. Like, for example, they grab the big bad boy, the Soviet general, they make him find an alternative source of time manipulation energy, very briefly, and he brings forth an army of fucking zombies or demons from a different dimension or some shit like that. Or he revives all of the zombies that you've killed throughout Katorga 12 throughout the island, or he simply brings all of the zombies from 1955 to the present to 2010 when the game ends, and you will go up against an endless spawn of zombies. By the end, an army of zombies pretty similar to Doom, and until the player doesn't reach a specific point, just like with the formula of Call of Duty, the player cannot finish the game. And they create that psychological sense of having one last obstacle that the player needs to overcome to earn the right to see the ending of the game, to earn the privilege of saying that the player finished the game. See how different the psychology should be, because that's the psychology that was used in original games, and sadly not implemented in this one, and in a lot of modern games. That is the problem. See, that it's not a matter of my mental perception, it's a matter of how to influence the psychological sense of progression of the player. Why? Because developers need to understand that the player needs to have an active role in overcoming those obstacles in that sense. So that's a critical flaw, not having a final boss and not implementing enough final boss fights throughout the game. While the enemies are scary in appearance, they are absolutely weak in terms of the gameplay mechanics implemented to them. So in that sense, that's the critical flaw for level design. Lack of a final boss, that's, as I said at the beginning, gaming 101, it's video games 101. You need the player to psychologically overcome the conflicts, and in this case the obstacles that the developer has to put in front of him. That's why Dark Souls is so successful, even if I don't like the stamina bar combat gameplay, but that's a different story. I despise it completely, and not because of the difficulty, because Sekiro is pretty well executed and I love it. That's why Metroid Prime is probably the most successful and the best FPS game of all time, only challenged maybe by Halo 2 and Call of Duty World at War and Modern Warfare 1, those other three, because the ending in all of those games, the final levels are excruciatingly, painfully difficult for the player, and that needs to be like that, because the second you take out difficulty, the second you take out the big bad final boss fight, doesn't matter if it's a continuous wave of soldiers, it doesn't matter if it's a big bad mutated final boss, it doesn't matter if the embodiment is singular or plural, if it's a wave of soldiers or one big bad mutated creature like in Doom, for example. Doom is so magnificent because it has the final mutated Mother Brain enemy, Doom 2016 and the classics as well, because it has those final levels. They need to be there, and a game that doesn't incorporate that basic philosophy, it's a critical flaw. It's an absolutely critical flaw in the level design. I have no problem playing linear games. Not all of them need to be open world. I would have added backtracking or some sort of replayability, but you can see that combined with the lack of replayability of not adding the zombies mode, with the lack of replayability of not incorporating final bosses or final stages that provide a real obstacle for the player to overcome constantly, so they feel that sense of progression and that sense of reward if they do beat it. That is it's a crippling combination of lack of replayability, and as I always mention, lack of replayability has a negative impact on the psychological sense of progression of the player, and you cannot remember those games that you can barely play. So, critical flaw, crippling flaw, lack of a final boss, especially, and lack of boss fights. So those are absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. In that sense, so the lack of replayability is terrible. In that sense, it's a shame because the gameplay mechanics are the core of the gameplay mechanics are perfectly executed, but one must have an integral view of what the game offers, of what the package is, as I've said, because otherwise Vanquish would be the best game of all time because it has perfect third-person shooter mechanics, but it's so incredibly short that is terrible. It's an amazing game. It's made by Platinum Games, but it's so short you can beat it in less than 4 hours. I don't know. So in that sense, they needed to work on that. And I see a lot of people arguing modernly that they want to go back to linear games that don't have replayability, that you just play the story and that's it, for example. But that's not the case. A lot of people say it because of Warhammer Space Marine 2, but Warhammer Space Marine 2 has more game modes. Here there is only one game mode, it's extremely limited, and you don't even, inside of that limited game mode, you don't have boss fights. So in that sense, I don't know if it was lack of budget or whatever, but it could have been handled much better if they would have put much more effort in terms of replayability. And I say all of this as a fan of Raven Software. I think Wolverine, X-Men Origins Wolverine is pretty good, but it's true that it also had this problem. It also had the problem of being, I remember it being an exemplary game in terms of the gameplay mechanics, an exemplary game, an incredible game in terms of the gameplay mechanics, but then not having an amazing final boss fight. It's the same flaw as Wolverine, now that I think of it. Because both games developed by Raven Software don't have amazing boss fights. Like, for example, in Darksiders 1, the final boss fight is amazing. I still remember it to this day, and I only played it once back in 2009. 2009 or 2010, I think it was. So yeah, pretty much. The lack of boss fights is crippling. Alright, so just so I don't continue criticizing this, because for me it's terrible, I think I covered all of the level design, the puzzles, everything, how it influences the economic system of the game, pretty much, the upgrades, blah 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 blah, etc, etc, etc. So pretty well done in general, pretty well done, the core gameplay mechanics, but that is, as I've said, it cripples all of the effort that they initially did to make this a good game. 100%. Alright, let's just do the fourth category of the analysis, the Grandeur category. In that sense, it will be the other side of the other face of the same coin. This one is impeccable. From the 3D audio that I mentioned previously, to how well the story progresses, the characters, the Katorga 12 incident, it plays a huge role, the story in this game. Characters act according to their personality and the period of time they are in, the time traveling segments, the time, basically in this game you arrived at Katorga 12 because there was an explosion. It's an isolated fictional Soviet island in the middle of the Pacific. You are a US Marine, you get there, the game uses the same system as Metroid Prime and Bioshock in the sense that it leaves you a lot of spoiler alert if you want to hear about this, you don't watch this part of the analysis, I guess. It leaves you a lot of messages that then we knew that they were written by the antagonist of the game. At the end of the game we know that Captain Renko is basically a US Marine. He gets to Katorga 12. It's an abandoned facility by 2010. A time manipulation event happens, and he goes back to 1955 with the explosion taking place there. our partner gets killed immediately at the beginning of the game. Then we join, let's say, the resistance of Catherine, a girl that is the she's the assistant of Dr. Barisov, who was the other the brilliant mind, the other scientist that, together with the main antagonist that I cannot even remember the name. In that sense, imagine how weird they were, the names, and they weren't repeated enough, I guess. Berkochev or something like that. Very, instead of Barisov, it was Berkochev or something like that. I don't remember. Pretty much the main antagonist. There are four characters in this game: the protagonist, Captain Renko, yourself, Catherine, supporting character, Barisov, and then the main antagonist of the game. That are basically the ones that will decide the fate of the Earth at the end of the day. So you get in there, you get into that exploding into the first buildings that explain what happened. The game also has some old school movie like Fallout, the small movies that tell you what happened. There was a time manipulation incident, and it deformed a lot of the population of Katorga 12. You start at a school, you get through a lot of segments. In that sense, the ambience of the game is 10 out of 10. Extremely eerie. There are a lot of jump scares in this game with the zombies and everything. It definitely respects its horror elements 100%. It respects its horror elements 100%. This game is absolutely amazing in that category. It has a lot of incredible horror elements that you'll appreciate, but it's not a survival horror, as we said in the initial genre classification. So I can recommend it to all of you who like those. Similar to Bioshock, similar to Dishonored, it has some eerie elements. The ambience is pretty well done. For example, looking at a shadow in a library, I remember, of the first scary zombies that you go up against at the beginning of the game. When you travel back to 1955, the game alters between 1955 and 2010 constantly in a perfectly intertwined timeline, in which you perfectly can see how you influence it with your actions. For example, saving Barisov at the beginning and ensuring that he's alive in 2010 then. And like that, the time travel transitions in that sense are perfectly fine. Pretty similar to the Prince of Persia to the Warrior Within. So in that sense, perfectly executed. The plot is complex in that sense. It's pretty well done. As I've said, looking at the shadow of a zombie in a library, and then it moves, and then you turn, and the zombie appears right on top of you. In that sense, it's not for the faint of heart. Think about Metro. Think about jump scares like that. So definitely highly recommended for those of you who appreciate the atmosphere of Bioshock, of Dishonored, of Metroid Prime, combined with the gameplay mechanics of Call of Duty. In that sense, there's nothing I can complain about in terms of the impact of the ambience. That's the Grandeur category about the impact of the ambience on the player. In that sense, I cannot complain. Very eerie. It has a very specific bloom that ensures that the player will feel scared at some points. Most of the player base. I didn't, but still, it has some pretty good jump scares. It's pretty well designed. If you played, I don't know, in the dark, it can feel like Resident Evil a bit. So yes, the ambience is perfect. The sounds that the zombies make are quite scary. Thanks to the 3D audio, you can feel them approaching. Pretty much, then by the end of the game, you have to carry the energy bomb, the time manipulation bomb, and you have to make a decision. You have 3 different outcomes. I looked it up after finishing the game. I chose the special outcome. In that sense, it's pretty well done, in which I kill both of them, both Barisov and the other person, and the main Russian general and etc. And pretty much the Soviet general, because we are back in 1955 in that sense of the Soviet Union, and pretty much that is pretty well executed. The time manipulation sections, all of the objectives feel realistic, characters act according to their personalities. The ambience changes, for example, the aesthetics of the health packs and the steam packs change when you go back in time to 1955 when compared to 2010 to the present. So in that sense, it's perfectly done. I cannot complain at all, and I highly recommend that if you like horror movies or Resident Evil or generally Bioshock or oppressive atmospheres in general, I can easily recommend this game to you, because the oppressive atmosphere feels exactly like Metroid, exactly like Bioshock in that sense. You are isolated in an island, which adds more to that context, and in the Pacific, close to the Russian coast, like it's a very remote location for most of civilization. Well, I'm talking to you about that from almost Antarctica, so pretty much it's the same. But I'm still in the capital, that is much more close to the. It's at the same height as Australia, so in that sense, it doesn't feel that remote. So it'll feel remote, it'll feel oppressive, the atmosphere, it'll feel everything. So yeah, pretty highly recommended for those of you who like that atmosphere, that kind of atmosphere. Good. In terms of the story, as I've said, the characters act perfectly, act according to their personality, the story is engaging and everything. The Grandeur category is a 10 out of 10. It's perfect. The ambience is perfect. It's even more prominent than the level design and the gameplay. So, getting to the last category of the analysis, the innovation category of it, I will say that this game is basically a modified version of Call of Duty Black Ops. It is true that the time manipulation mechanics are unique, especially the time stopping energy field that you get by the end of the game, and no, not by the but the mid-game gameplay mechanics. But the mid-game gameplay, it is true that it's pretty well executed in that sense, because it adds a lot of variety to the classic zombies mode of Call of Duty. It feels like a permanent zombies mode, this game, which that's why it's a tragedy that they didn't include a real zombies mode with the specific enemies of this game. So in that sense, I highly recommend it. If you want to explore a modified version of Call of Duty as well, not only because of the atmosphere, and pretty well done. That time manipulation, those time manipulation mechanics, the fact that you can individually age enemies or do an area of effect attack, or well, pretty much, I don't know. There are some other time manipulation techniques. They affect creatures differently. It's the same, but they affect creatures differently. The melee attack, we have seen melee attacks like with a small range in the past. We have seen them. So with a small area of effect. So that cannot count as innovation. The level design is the same as Call of Duty, with a bit of Bioshock influence in it. In that sense, it doesn't have a lot of innovation. Only the time manipulation and adding that slight skill tree. No, but it was done in Bioshock as well, kind of like upgrading your stuff. Well, let's say that it is extensively done. Like it adds a bit more of abstract complexity. It is true, like it adds a bit more of abstract complexity than Bioshock to the skill tree, particularly. We could argue the rest of the elements, but in that sense, upgrading, having a dual, let's say, skill tree system in which you can upgrade the damage of your weapons and the damage and modify your time manipulation abilities. In that sense, it's pretty original, but that's pretty much where the innovation ends. The first boss fight I can think of, and the ambience. Everything is directed at the ambience, pretty much. So it doesn't have a lot of innovation. It feels like a modified Call of Duty game. I cannot think about any element besides the ones that I mentioned, and enemy variety, which is pretty well implemented, but Call of Duty Zombies did implement it previously with pretty similar patterns to the creatures in here. It's true that here there's a variation, but still. So it feels like a modified Call of Duty game that doesn't help with the innovation category of the analysis at all. So I think integrating a light RPG system is not enough as to kind of like redefine the genre mechanics of the FPS genre. It doesn't redefine anything at all. It brings elements from Sniper Elite with that guided bullet, so there's not much I can tell you about innovation, and I usually dissect games kind of like every single element, but I cannot think of any other element other than the skill tree integration or the specific mechanics of influencing the enemy according to the enemy variety, affecting, for example, the sex that become invisible and those things. But even so, in Killzone, for example, in Killzone 2, Radek becomes invisible in the final boss fight. See, for example, Radek, it's an amazing final boss fight that basically, I love how Killzone 2 peaks at the final boss. In that sense, it's perfectly executed, and the reason why Killzone 2 is still remembered and regarded as a very good FPS game, even if it doesn't have the quality of Halo throughout. It doesn't keep the consistency of Halo throughout the game. But the final boss fight has a lot of character, and it has a lot of amazing emotion. It has an emotional charge to it because of how Radek deals with Templar, who was the protagonist of the previous game. It has an emotional charge that is perfectly executed, and it's a challenging boss fight that definitely, he becomes invisible and he can attack you out of nowhere in close range. It's a perfect example of how to balance melee weapons and ranged weapons and creating a legendary boss fight by the end of the game. In that sense, Killzone 2 is amazing because of its final boss fight, and that makes it one of the best FPS games in that sense. The best FPS that Sony ever created, not even the advertising that they did of Destiny 1 when they got the advertising licenses, that when they tried to copy Halo. Now Killzone and Resistance were the way they needed to go. But well, degeneracy and money cause all of those flaws, all of those mistakes that could have been it could have been a different story had they supported the Killzone franchise a bit more. Alright, people. Because of all of these reasons, in terms of the innovation category of the analysis, Singularity doesn't redefine any mechanic, except for the few ones that I mentioned that don't even have a significant impact in terms of the gameplay mechanics. So yeah, pretty much I cannot tell you any relevant mechanic that redefines the essence of the FPS genre coming from Singularity. In that sense, so yeah, pretty much. We can see that in the fact that this game feels like Call of Duty all the time. So in that sense, I would say that the innovation is next to non-existent, and it's a negative element as well. So this is a tricky game to qualify. Extremely tricky. Why? Because the core gameplay mechanics are amazing. They are flawless. Because they inherit the perfect formula of Call of Duty. They inherit the perfect formula of Call of Duty. They inherit the perfect formula of Call of Duty of having very smooth shooting mechanics and gameplay and the weight of the weapons and how they interact with the time manipulation mechanics and pretty much everything so in that sense, sorry about that, I had someone send me a message. In that sense, it's very tricky to award a final qualification for this game because the core gameplay mechanics are shared with Call of Duty, which Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1 it's pretty much a 10 out of 10, and Black Ops 1 as well. Not the second one. The second one is a disaster. I hate it. I have my reasons in case you want to listen to them. I'll tell you, but basically it has to do with the difficulty. But Modern Warfare 1 and Black Ops 1 are the pinnacle. They are the pinnacle of this formula. Some of the best FPS games of all time, if not the best. So we have a core, the core of the gameplay mechanics that is perfect because it is inherited from Call of Duty. But I gave you a myriad of reasons. Among them, the worst one, the critical one, it's kind of like it resides in the level design, which is the fact that it cannot which is the fact that it doesn't have a final boss and it doesn't have final bosses, and I explain you how basic that element is and how it psychologically impacts the player. And because of that, critical flaw, but among them the rest that I highlighted during the analysis, I give you a myriad of objective reasons why this game has several flaws. And because of all of that, because of especially the lack of a final boss and a lack of replayability in terms of the level design, we have flaws in the gameplay, flaws in the level design, flaws in the technical aspect of it because of the muddy textures inherited from Call of Duty, flaws, except for the Grandeur category, flaw in the innovation is next to non-existent. Because of all of that cumulative stockpile of flaws, this game cannot pierce through the minimum of being a modified version of Call of Duty. Because of all of that. If it had replayability, if it had only a zombies mode, or final bosses in the main story of the game, one final boss and several bosses, right? If it had those, with those simple elements, that they had the assets, they had the level design to support it and everything. With all of that, we would be talking about a game of 8 of a B or even an A, or if they implemented all of the ideas that I mentioned, even a perfect game. Without the bosses, without the final bosses of the story, it's a crippling thing. It can never be a perfect game. It cannot get beyond a B minus in that sense. If we combine that with the muddy textures of the technical aspect inherited from the Call of Duty engine, combined with the level design of not having final bosses and not having backtracking and not having any kind of replayability or any variety in the game modes, the limited weapon variety as well, with all of that, I'll award this game because of the perfectly polished core gameplay inherited from Call of Duty, with the skill tree system innovation, which is the only thing I can highlight in that sense, and the smooth gameplay mechanics inherited as well from Call of Duty, that could have been that were slightly expanded upon because of the time manipulation innovation, that those elements are the saving graces of this game. Without them, this could have been a disaster. I will award the game a C minus, basically a C, a 6 out of 10 in that sense, like 6.5 maybe out of 10, but it accumulates a lot of flaws. The worst one being the one that I mentioned, that video games are an active form of entertainment, and this game defies gaming 101, as I've said. Objectively speaking, the psychological sense of progression, of overcoming the difficulties that a boss provides. In that sense, it makes the same flaw as well, a lot of people will hate me for this. It will be an unpopular opinion. If you like Half-Life 2, not the first one, Half-Life 2, if you like that one, it does have the same flaw. I know a lot of people think Half-Life is a 10 out of 10, but the fact that it doesn't have a legendary final boss fight, I think it's an element that limits it. In that sense, the first Wolfenstein, the modern reboot of Wolfenstein, deals with this perfectly. So there, and Bioshock as well, and Dishonored, the final section, while as I've said, the embodiment of the final boss doesn't need to be only one big bad mutated monster. It can be like Call of Duty. It can be like, for example, like Wolfenstein, the reboot, in the sense that you go up against a final wave of enemies. It doesn't need to be singular, the final boss. It doesn't need to be embodied, the embodiment of one big mutated beast. It can be a wave of enemy soldiers. In that sense, Killzone 2 replicates that perfectly, or Halo 2. They have both of them. They have a big bad final boss fight in Dishonored. In the case of Halo 1, it does have it, but Halo 2, they are kind of like inverted. And they also have the endless waves of enemies in assaulting the Rage Palace or whatever. In Killzone 2, it's the same as in Call of Duty World at War. You have to assault the final palace of the Emperor. It's the same. So, pick your solution. There are ways to pick your solution: a big bad final boss fight, or having a plural embodiment in several waves of enemy soldiers. It doesn't matter. A final survival mission, for example. In that sense, StarCraft, the RTS genre, handles it like that, with a final survival mission generally, or going up against several bases. There are several ways of dealing with what I'm describing, with, as I've said, gaming 101. The psychological impact of getting through obstacles that a game needs to have. It needs to have that element, because otherwise you are destroying the psychological sense of progression on the player. It's a basic element that, if it's not there, it's a critical flaw. Metroid Prime, for example, is another great example of handling this with its final bosses. It's a sacred, blessed element, legendary element. Use whichever adjective you want. It's an essential element of the industry as a whole that you just cannot skip altogether, like this game does, because it destroys the very psychological sense of progression, of overcoming obstacles. And it's even more, it's even worse in a game that has those creatures that you can go up against. Like, it would have been as simple as creating a fucking Godzilla like final boss fight and making it like Metroid Prime. See, Metroid Prime is also slow in terms of its shooting mechanics. It's not like Call of Duty. If they wanted to go for something like that, they could have looked at Metroid Prime, for example. So I'll award the game C minus, a 6, exclusively because of the smooth gameplay elements and everything that it has inherited from Call of Duty and the abstract complexity of the skill tree system. But even Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1 has a distinct, hard final section in which you need to get to Imran Sakaev. See, I remember the name. Spontaneously because it was a hard section, and this game is not hard by the end of it. That is another huge problem. I remember it, and the final playing sequence of Modern Warfare 1, just like the assault on the Rage Palace of World at War, they are all sections that don't need a single. It doesn't matter if the embodiment, if the abstract embodiment of the final boss, it's a single big bad mutated creature of waves of Soviet soldiers or I don't know military soldiers from the Rage or whatever in World War II, or in Metroid Prime, it's a single entity. It doesn't matter if it's a single entity or several soldiers, but the abstract concept of a final obstacle that needs to be surpassed, that needs to be that you need to overcome as a main concept of any story that involves a beginning, a conflict, and a resolution, and a final ending. It needs to be there, because otherwise you are destroying the essence of any story in general, not only a video game. It's even worse. You are defying that. So, but especially in the art of video games, it's especially terrible. It's especially terrible. Especially terrible. It's especially terrible in that sense. So that's the reason. A perfect core. This game is a perfect core surrounded by a lot of critical flaws, essentially. Even so, I can recommend this game if you've already played Bioshock, if you've already played Dishonored, if you've already played Metroid Prime. That one, you need to play Metroid Prime, the first one especially. The other ones, no, though the second one is pretty good, but the first Metroid Prime it's absolutely needed. So in that sense, if you played all of those and you want to see how a combination of those games' atmosphere with Call of Duty would be like, this game is pretty much your only option in existence. In that sense, it's unique, but that is not enough to justify abolishing basic gameplay elements altogether. Like that's a critical flaw, regardless of the game that we are talking about. So even so, I would say that I enjoyed my time with the game, but it, as I've said, critical game flaws, and I awarded it a C minus or a 6 overall because of how smooth the Call of Duty experience core still is. Like, if you like Call of Duty, the story is different. I can tell you, well, play the game because it cannot do you any harm. It cannot do you any harm. It's like, but it feels like an expansion of Black Ops 1. It feels like an expansion. You don't go in expecting something like Bioshock that completely turns the experience upside down. In that sense, I'm telling you that expect kind of like something similar to a mod of Black Ops 1. Expect something like that. Expect something like that, because that's what you will get. A very solid core, because of all of the inherited elements, surrounded by a lot of critical flaws. Alright, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, people, we finish the final analysis of Singularity. As I always say, a special thanks to all Discord members and followers of the Twitch channel from the bottom of my heart. I know that you watch all of the streams as bots. That you watch all of the streams as bots. Then, whenever I finish, thank you from the bottom of my heart for always supporting my crazy metaphysical analysis here on the channel, and I deeply appreciate your company whenever you drop by the stream and chat with me. Especially deeply appreciated. To all of you, thanks from the bottom of my heart. Hope my analyses are enjoyable and useful for all of you. And of course, also thanks to YouTube subscribers from the bottom of my heart for also watching all of this in the future, perhaps, because usually the analysis have a lot of watch of views after they go over at YouTube and people discover them. So thanks to YouTube subscribers also from the bottom of my heart. Always feel free to come over here and chat with me with everything. Anyways, consume it as a Netflix show. Pretty much, it's like a Netflix show. The crazy it would be, what was it? The crazy post-mortem metaphysical analysis show would be. Alright. Game Autopsy channel would be. Alright. So thanks from the bottom of my heart. And thanks to anyone who might have taken the time to watch this as a YouTube bod or a Twitch bod in the future. Deep thanks. And we'll continue with the next game for analysis on Thursday, because on Tuesdays we are playing Dragon's Sang the Dark Eye, that I still also highly recommend if you like classic RPGs. We are analyzing that one. We are still dissecting the early game